The populace had feared Esmilla, the black-robed wizardess, and fear implies a certain amount of respect. How much worse if they had merely laughed at her? Antimotus recalled his own thoughts. Hearing them repeated in this childish treble sent a shiver up his spine. A child should not be this wise, should not be forced to bear the burden of such cynical wisdom this young. Rayson smiled then, an ingenious smile. It's a hammer blow. I think about what you told me, sir, about the hammer blows forge the soul. And the water cools them, except I don't cry. Or if I do, he added, his voice hardening, it's when they can't see me. Antimotus stared, amazed and confused. Part of him wanted to hug close his precocious child, while another part warned him to snatch the child up and toss him into the fire, crush him as one crushes the egg of a viper. This dichotomy of emotion so unsettled him that he was forced to rise to his feet and take a turn about the room before he felt capable of continuing the conversation. Rayson stood silently, waiting patiently for the adult to finish indulging himself in the strange and inexplicable behavior adults often exhibited. The boy's gaze left Antimotus and strayed to the bookshelves, where the gaze focused and sharpened with a hungry edge. That reminded Antimotus of something he'd meant to tell the boy and had, in the ensuing disturbing conversation, almost forgotten. He returned to his chair, sat forward in the seat. I meant to tell you, young man. I saw your sister when I was on my travels. Rayson's gaze darted back to the Archmage, was alight with interest. Kitiara? You saw her, sir? Yes, I was quite astonished, I may tell you. One doesn't expect a girl that age, he paused, not quite certain where, under the light of the lad's blue eyes, to go from here. Rayson understood. She left home shortly after I was enrolled in the school, Archmages. I think she'd wanted to leave before that, but she was worried about Caramon and me. Me especially. She figures that now I can take care of myself. You're still only a child, Antimotus said sternly, deciding precociousness had gone far enough. But I can take care of myself, Rayson said, and the smile, the smirk Antimotus had seen earlier touched his lips. The smile widened when Master Theobald's loud, haranguing voice was heard booming through the door. Kitiara came home a couple of months after she left, before winter set in, Rayson continued. She gave Father some money to pay for her room and board. He said it wasn't necessary, but she said it was. She wouldn't take anything from him ever again. She wore a sword, a real one. It had dried blood on it. She gave Caramon a sword, but Father was angry and took it away from him. She didn't stay long. Where did you see her? I can't quite recall the name of the place, Antimotus said, carefully evasive. These small towns, they all look alike after a while. She was in a tavern with some companions. Disreputable companions, he almost said, but he didn't, not wanting to upset the child, who seemed genuinely fond of his half-sister. He had seen her among mercenary soldiers of the very worst sort, the kind who sell their swords for money, and are willing to sell their souls to if anyone happened to want the wretched things. She told me a story about you, Antimotus went on quickly, not giving the child time to ask more questions. She said that when your father first brought you here, to Master Theobald's, you came into his library, this very room, sat down and began to read one of the Book of Magic. At first, Raistlin looked startled. Then he smiled. Not the smirk, but a mischievous grin that reminded Antimodus that this boy really was only 6 years old. "That wouldn't be possible," Raistlin said with a sidelong glance at Antimodus. "I'm only now learning to read and write magic." "I know it's not possible," Antimodus replied, smiling himself. The boy could be quite charming when he chose. Where would she have come by such a story, then? "My brother," Raistlin answered. "We were in the classroom, and my father and the master were talking about letting me enter the school. The master didn't want to admit me." Antimodus raised his eyebrows, shocked. "How do you know? Did he say so?" "Not in so many words, but he said I wasn't properly brought up. I should speak only when I was addressed, and I should keep my eyes down and not stare him out of countenance. That's what he said. I was pert and glib and disrespectful." "So you are, Raistlin," admonished Antimodus, thinking he should. "You should show your master and your classmates more respect." Raistlin shrugged, dismissed them all with that shrug, and continued with his story. "I got bored listening to Father apologize for me, and so Caramon and I went exploring. We came in here. I pulled a book off the shelf. One of the spell books. Only a practice one. The master keeps the real spell books locked up in his cellar, I know." The child's voice was cool, serious. The eyes glistened with longing. Antimodus was suitably alarmed and made a mental note to warn Theobald that his precious spell books may not be as safe as the master imagined. Then suddenly the boy was a boy again. "I may have told Caramon the spellbook was real," Raistlin said, the mischievous grin returning. "I don't remember. Anyway, Master Theobald came dashing in, all huffing and puffing and mad. He scolded me for wandering off and invading his privacy. And when he saw me with a book, he got madder still. I wasn't reading a spell. I couldn't even read any of it." "But," Raistlin gave Antimodus a sly glance, "there's an illusionist in town. His name is Wayland, and I've heard him use magic. And I memorized some of the words. I know the spells won't work, but I use them for fun when the other boys are playing at war. I said some of the words. Caramon was all excited and told Father that I was going to summon a demon from the abyss. Master Theobald got really red in the face and grabbed the book away from me. He knew I wasn't really reading the words," Raistlin added coolly. "He just wanted a chance to get rid of me." "Master Theobald accepted you into his school," Antimodus said sternly. "He didn't get rid of you, as you put it. And what you did was wrong. You should not have taken the book without his permission." "He had to take me," Raistlin said flatly. "My schooling was bought and paid for." He stared very hard at Antimodus, who, having expected this, was prepared for it and returned the stare with bland innocence. The child had met his match. He lowered his gaze, shifted it to the bookcase. One corner of his mouth twitched. "Caramon must have told Kitiara. He really did think I was going to summon a demon, you know. Caramon's like a candor. He'll believe anything you tell him." "Do you love your brother?" Antimodus asked impulsively. "Of course," Raistlin responded blandly, smoothly. "He's my twin." "Yes, you are twins, aren't you?" Antimodus said reflectively, "I wonder if your brother has a talent for magic. It would seem logical." He stopped, confounded, struck dumb by the look Raistlin gave him. It was a blow, as if the child had struck out with his fists. No, not with fists, with a dagger. Antimodus recoiled, startled unpleasantly by the malevolence in the child's expression. The question had been idle, harmless. He had certainly not expected such a reaction. "May I return to class now, sir?" Raistlin asked politely. His face was smooth, if somewhat pale. Yes. I enjoyed our visit," said Antimodus. Raistlin made no comment. He bowed politely, as all the boys were taught to bow, then went to the door, opened it. A wave of noise and heat, bringing with it the smell of small boys and boiled cabbage and ink, surged into the library, reminding Antimodus of the tide coming in on the dirty beaches at Flotsam. The door shut behind the boy. Antimodus sat quite still for long moments, recovering. This was difficult to do at first, because he kept seeing those blue poniard eyes, glittering with anger, sliding through his flesh. Finally, realizing that the day was winding on, and that he wanted to reach the inn of the last home before dark, Antimodus shook off the after-effects of the unfortunate scene and returned to the schoolroom to make his farewells to Master Theobald. Book 2. I will do this. Nothing in my life matters except this. No moment in my life exists except this moment. I am born in this moment, and if I fail, I will die in this moment. Raistlin Majere. "Raist, over here!" Caramon waved from the front of the of the farmer's cart, which he was driving. At the age of 13, so tall and broad and muscular that he often passed for much older, Caramon had become Farmer Sedge's top field hand. Caramon's hair curled on his brow in soft auburn rings. His eyes were cheerful, friendly, and guileless, gullible. The children adored him, and so did every shyster, beggar, and con artist that passed through Solace. He was unusually strong for his age, also unusually gentle. He had a formidable temper when riled, but the fuse was buried so deep and took so long to burn that Caramon usually realized he was angry only when the quarrel had long since ended. The only time his anger exploded was when someone threatened his twin. Raistlin lifted his hand to acknowledge his brother's shout. He was glad to see Caramon, glad to see a friendly face. 7 winters ago, Raistlin had decided that he must board at Master Theobald's school during the coldest months of the year, an arrangement that meant, for the first time in their lives, the twin brothers were separated. 7 winters passed, and with Raistlin absent from his home. In springtime, like this spring, when the sun melted the frozen roads and brought the first green and golden buds to the Valen woods, the twins were reunited. Long ago, Raistlin had given up secretly, hoping that someday he would look into a mirror and see himself the image of his handsome twin. Raistlin, with his fine-boned features and large eyes, his soft-to-the-touch reddish hair that brushed his shoulders, would have been the more handsome of the two, but... "Raced! Over here!" Caramon waved from the front of the farmer's cart which he was driving. Sorry, that's just a mistake here. That page is repeated. So going back long ago, Raistlin had given up, secretly hoping that someday he would look into a mirror and see in himself the image of his handsome twin. Raistlin, with his fine-boned features and large eyes, his soft-to-the-touch reddish hair that brushed his shoulders, would have been the more handsome of the two, but for his eyes. They held the gaze too long, stared too deeply, saw too much, and there was always the faint hint of scorn in them, for he saw clearly the shams and artifices and absurdities of people, and was both amused and disgusted with them. Jumping down from the cart, Caramon gave his brother a boisterous hug, which Raistlin did not return. He used a bundle of clothes he held in both arms as an excuse to avoid an overt show of affection, a show Raistlin found undignified and annoying. His body stiffened in his brother's embrace, but Caramon was too excited to notice. He grabbed the bundle, flung it in the back of the cart. "Come on, I'll help you up," Caramon offered. Raistlin was beginning to think he wasn't as glad to see his twin as he'd first imagined. He had forgotten how irritating Caramon could be. "I'm perfectly capable of climbing onto a farm cart without assistance," Raistlin returned. "Oh, sure, Raist." Caramon grinned, not the least offended. He was too stupid to be offended. Raistlin pulled himself up onto the cart. Caramon bounded up into the driver's seat. Grasping the reins, he made clucking sounds with his tongue at the horse, turned the beast around, and started back up the road towards Solis. "What's that?" Caramon jerked his head around, looked behind him at the school. "Pay no attention to them, my brother," Raistlin said quietly. Classes were over. The master usually took advantage of this time of day to meditate, which meant that he could be found in the library with a closed book and an open bottle of the port wine for which northern Urgoth was famous. He would remain in his meditative state until dinner, when the housekeeper would awake him. The boys were supposed to use this time for study, but Master Theobald never checked on them, and so they were left to their own devices. Today a group had gathered at the back of the school to bid farewell to Raistlin. "Bye, Sly," they were yelling in unison, the cry being led by their instigator, a tall boy with carrot-orange hair and freckles, who was new to the school. "Sly?" Caramon looked at his brother. "They mean you, don't they?" His brows came together in an angry scowl. "Whoa there!" He brought the cart to a halt. "Caramon, let it pass," Raistlin said, placing his hand on his brother's muscular arm. "I won't, Raist," Caramon returned. "They shouldn't call you names like that." His hands clenched into fists that, for a 13-year-old boy, were formidable. "Caramon, no," Raistlin ordered sharply. "I will deal with them in my own time, in my own way." "Are you sure, Raist?" Caramon was glaring back at the towning boys. "They won't call you names like that after... If their lips are split open." "Not today, perhaps," Raistlin said, "but I have to go back to them tomorrow. Now drive on. I want to reach home before dark." Caramon obeyed. He always obeyed when his twin commanded. Raistlin was the acknowledged thinker of the two, a fact that Caramon cheerfully admitted. Caramon had come to depend on Raistlin's guidance in most areas of life, including the games they played with the other boys, games such as Goblin Ball, Candor Keep Away, and Thane Beneath the Mountain. Due to his frail health, Raistlin could not participate in such exuberant sports, but he watched intently. His quick mind developed strategies for winning, which he passed on to his brother. Minus Raistlin's tutelage, Caramon would mistakenly score goals for his opponents in Goblin Ball. He nearly always ended up being the Candor in Candor Keep Away, and he constantly fell victim to the military tactics of the older Stern Brightblade in Thane Beneath the Mountain. When Raistlin was there to remind him which end of the field was which, and to offer cunning ploys to outwit his opponents, Caramon was a winner more often than not. Once again, he clocked the horse. The cart rolled down the rutted road. The catcalls ended. The boys grew bored and turned to other sport. "I don't understand why you didn't let me pound them," Caramon complained. "Because," Raistlin answered silently, "I know what would happen, how it would end. You would pound them, as you so elegantly put it, my brother. Then you would help them to their feet, slap them on their backs, tell them you know they didn't mean it, and in the end you would all be the best of friends. Except for me. Except for the sly one. No, the lesson will be mine to teach. They will learn what it means to be sly." He might have continued to sit, brooding and plotting and mulling over such wrongs, but for his brother, who was rattling on about their parents, their friends, and the fine day. Caramon's cheerful gossip teased his brother out of his ill humor. The air was soft and warm and smelled of growing things, compounded with horse and newly mown grass, much better smells than that of cooked cabbage and boys who bathed only once a week. Raistlin breathed deeply of the soft, fragrant air, and didn't cough. The sunshine warmed him pleasantly, and he found himself listening with keen enjoyment to his brother's conversation. "Father's been gone these last 3 weeks and likely won't be back until the end of the month. Mother remembered that you were coming home today. She's been a lot better lately, Raist. You'll notice a change ever since the widow Judith started coming to stay with her when she has her bad days." "Widow Judith?" Raistlin said sharply. "Who's Judith? And what do you mean, stay with Mother when she has her bad days? What about you and Father?" Caramon shifted uncomfortably on his seat. "It was a hard winter, Raist. You were gone. Father had to work. He couldn't take off, or we would have starved. When Farmer Sedge was snowed in and didn't need me, I got a job in the stables, feeding the horses and mucking out. We tried leaving Mother alone, but, well, it wasn't working. One day she tipped over a candle and didn't notice. It nearly burned down the house. We did the best we could, Raist." Raistlin said nothing. He sat on the cart, grimly silent, angry at his father and brother. They should not have left his mother in the care of strangers. He was angry at himself. He should not have left her. "The widow Judith is real nice, Raist," Caramon went on defensively. "Mother likes her a lot. Judith comes every morning and she helps Mother dress and fixes her hair. She makes her eat something and then they do sewing and stuff like that. Judith talks to Mother a lot and keeps her from going into her fits." He glanced uneasily at his brother. "Sorry, I mean trances." What do they talk about? Rayson asked. Cameron looked startled. I don't know. Female stuff, I guess. I never listened. And how can we afford to pay this woman? Cameron grinned. We don't pay her. That's what's great about it, Race. She does it for nothing. Since when have we lived off charity? Rayson demanded. It's not charity, Race. We offered to pay her, but she wouldn't take it. She helps others as part of her religion. That new order we heard about in Haven, the Belzerites or some such thing, she's one of them. I don't like this, Rayson said, frowning. No one does something for nothing. What is she after? After? What could she be after? It's not like we have a house crammed with jewels. The widow Judith is just a real nice person, Race. Can't you believe that? Apparently Rayson could not, for he continued to ask questions. How did you come across such a nice person, my brother? Actually, she came to us, Cameron said after taking a moment to recollect. She came to the door one day and said that she'd heard Mother wasn't feeling well. She knew we menfolk, Cameron spoke the plural with a touch of pride, needed to be out working, and said that she'd be glad to sit with Mother while we were gone. She told us she was a widow lady. Her own man was dead, her children grown and moved on. She was lonely herself. And the high priest of Belzor had commanded her to help others. Who is Belzor? Rayson asked suspiciously. By this time, even Caramel's patience was exhausted. Name of the abyss, I don't know, Rayson, he said. Ask her yourself. Only be nice to widow Judith, all right? She's been real nice to us. Rayson did not bother to respond. He fell into another brooding silence. He did not himself know why this should upset him. Perhaps it was nothing more than his own feelings of guilt for having abandoned his mother to the care of strangers, yet something about this wasn't quite right. Cameron and his father were too trusting, too ready to believe in the goodness of people. They could both be easily taken in. No one devoted hours of her day to caring for another without expecting to gain something by it. No one. Cameron was casting his brother worried, anxious glances. You're not mad at me, Race, are you? I'm sorry I snapped at you. It's just, well, you haven't met the widow yet, and... You seem to be faring well, my brother, Rayson interrupted. He did not want to hear any more about Judith. Cameron straightened his back proudly. I've grown 4 inches since fall. Father measured me on the door frame. I'm taller than all our friends now, even Sturm. Rayson had noticed. He could not help but notice that Cameron was no longer a child. He had grown that winter into a comely young man, sturdy, tall for his age, with a mass of curly hair and wide-open, almost unbearably honest brown eyes. He was cheerful and easygoing, polite to his elders, fun-loving and companionable. He would laugh heartily at any joke, even if it was against himself. He was considered a friend by every young person in town, from the stern and generally morose Sturm Brideblade to the toddlers of Farmer Sedge, who clamored for rides on Caramel's broad shoulders. As for the adults, their neighbors, especially the women, felt sorry for the lonely boy and were always inviting him to share a meal with the family. Due to the fact that he never turned down a free meal, even if he'd already just eaten, Caramon was probably the best-fed youngster in Solace. Any word from Kitiara? Rayson asked. Caramon shook his head. Nothing all winter. It's been over a year now since we heard from her. Do you think I mean, maybe she's dead? The brothers exchanged glances, and in that exchange, the resemblance between the two, not usually noticeable, was quite apparent. Both shook their heads. Caramon laughed. All right, she's not dead. Where is she then? Solamnia, said Raistlin. What? Caramon was astonished. How do you know that? Where else would she go? She went to search for her father, or at least for his people, her kin. Why would she need them? Caramon wondered. She's got us. Rayson snorted and said nothing. She'll be back for us at any rate, Caramon said confidently. Will you go with her, Rayst? Perhaps, Rayson said, after I've passed the test. Test? Is that like the test Father gives? Caramon looked indignant. Miss one lousy sum and get sent to bed without any supper. A guy could starve to death, and what good is arithmetic to a warrior anyway? Whack! Whack! Caramon slashed an imaginary sword through the air, startling the horse. Hey, hoops! Sorry there, Bess. I suppose I might need to know numbers for counting the heads of all the goblins I'm going to kill, or how many pieces of pie to cut, but that's it. I certainly don't need twice, times, and divisors and all that. Then you'll grow up ignorant, said Rayson coldly, like a gully dwarf. Caramon clapped his brother on the shoulder. I don't care. You can do all the twice times for me. There might be a time when I'm not there, Caramon, Rayson said. We'll always be together, Rayst, Caramon returned complacently. We're twins. I need you for twice times. You need me to look after you. Rayson sighed inwardly. No, sorry, Caramon said that. You need me to look after you. Rayson sighed inwardly, conceding this to be true. And it wouldn't be so bad, he thought. Caramon's brawn combined with his brain. Stop the cart, Rayson ordered. Startled, Caramon yanked on the reins, brought the horse to a halt. What is it? You gotta go pee? Should I come with you? What? Rayson slid off the seat. Stay there. Wait for me, I won't be long. Landing on the hard-baked dirt, he left the road and plunged into the thick weeds and underbrush. Beyond him, a stand of wheat rippled like a golden lake, washed up against a shoreline of dark green pines. Pawing through the weeds, shoving them aside impatiently, Rayson searched for the glint of white he'd seen from the cart. There it was. White flowers with waxy petals set against large dark green leaves with saw-toothed edges. Tiny filaments hung from the leaves. Rayson paused, inspecting the plant. He identified it easily. The problem was how to gather it. He ran back to the cart. What is it? Caramon craned his neck to see. A snake? Did you find a snake? A plant, Rayson said. Reaching into the cart, he grabbed hold of his bundle of clothes, pulled out a shirt. He returned to his find. A plant? Caramon repeated, his face wrinkling in puzzlement. He brightened. Can you eat it? Rayson did not reply. He knelt beside the plant, the shirt wrapped around his hand. With his left hand he unclasped a small knife from his belt and moving cautiously, carefully to keep his bare hand from brushing against the filaments, he snipped several of the leaves from the stem. He picked up the leaves with a hand protected by the shirt and, carrying them gingerly, returned to the wagon. Caramon stared. "All that for a bunch of leaves?" "Don't touch it," Raisin warned. Caramon snatched his hand back. "Why not?" "You see those little filaments on the leaves?" What? "Hairs. The tiny hairs on the leaves? This plant is called the stinging nettle. Touch the leaves and they'll sting you enough to raise red welts on your skin. It's very painful. Sometimes people even die from it if they react badly to it." "Ooh!" Caramon peered down at the nettle leaves lying on the bottom of the wagon. "What do you want to do with a plant like that?" Raistlin settled himself back on the wagon's seat. "I study them." "But they could hurt you," Caramon protested. "Why do you want to study something that could hurt you?" "You practice with the sword Kitiara brought you. Remember the first time you swung it? You nearly cut your foot off." "I still have the scar," Caramon said sheepishly. "Yeah, I guess that's true." He clucked at the horse, and the cart lurched forward. The brothers spoke of other matters after that. Caramon did most of the talking, relating the news of Soleis, those who had newly moved into town, those who had left, those who had been born, and those who had died. He told of the small adventures of their group of friends, children with whom they'd grown up, and the truly remarkable news. A Kender had taken up residency, the one who'd caused such a stir at the fair. He'd moved in with that grumpy dwarf metalsmith, much to the dwarf's ire, but what could you do about it, short of drowning the Kender, whose untimely demise was expected daily? Raistlin listened in silence, letting his brother's voice flow over him, warming him like the spring sunshine. Caramon's cheerful, mindless prattle removed some of the dread Raistlin felt, dread about going home and seeing his mother again. Her health had always been fading, it seemed to him. The winters drained her, sapped her strength. Every spring he returned to find her a little paler, a little thinner, a little farther removed into her dream world. As for this widow Judith helping her, he would believe that when he saw it. "I can drop you off at the crossroads, Raist," Caramon offered. "I have to work in the fields until sundown, or you can come with me if you want. You can rest in the wagon until it's time to go home. That way we can walk back together." "I'll go with you, my brother," Raisin said placidly. Caramon flushed with pleasure. He started telling Raistlin all about the family life of Farmer Sedge and the little Sedges. Raistlin cared nothing about any of them. He had staved off the hour when he must return home. He had ensured that he would not be alone when he first encountered Rosamond, and he had made Caramon happy. It took so little to make Caramon happy. Raisin glanced back at the stinging nettle leaves he'd gathered. Noticing that they were starting to wilt in the sunshine, he tenderly wrapped the shirt more closely around them. "John Farnish," said Master Theobald, sitting at his desk at the front of the class. "The assignment was to gather 6 herbs that may be used for spell components. Come forward and show us what you found." John Farnish, red hair gleaming, his freckled face carefully arranged to appear solemn and studious, at least while it was in view of the master, slid off the high stool and made his way to the front of the classroom. John Farnish bowed to Master Theobald, who smiled and nodded. Master Theobald had taken a liking to John Farnish, who never failed to be immensely impressed whenever Master Theobald cast the most minor of spells. Turning his back on Master Theobald, facing his classmates, John Farnish rolled his eyes, puffed out his cheeks, and pulled his mouth down at the corners, making a ludicrous caricature of his teacher. His classmates covered their mouths to hide their mirth, or looked down hurriedly at their desks. One actually began to laugh, then tried to change it into a cough, with the result that he nearly choked himself. Master Theobald frowned. "Silence, please! John Farnish, do not let these rowdy individuals upset you." "I'll try not to, Master," said John Farnish. "Continue, please." "Yes, Master." John Farnish thrust his hand into his pouch. "The first plant I gathered—" He halted, sucked in a breath, gasped and screeched in pain. Flinging the pouch to the floor, he wrung his right hand. Something stung me," he babbled. "Oh, it hurts like fire, ow!" Tears streamed down his cheeks. He thrust his hand beneath his armpit and did a little dance of agony in the front of the room. Only one of his classmates was smiling now. Master Theobald rose to his feet, hastened forward. Prying loose John's hand, the mage examined it, gave a grunt. "Go into the kitchen and ask cook for some butter to put on it." "What is it?" John Farnish gasped between moans. "A wasp? A snake?" Picking up the pouch, Master Theobald peered inside. "You silly boy! You've picked stinging nettle leaves. Perhaps from now on you'll pay more attention in class. Go along with you and stop sniveling. Raistlin Magier, come forward." Raistlin walked to the front of the class, made a polite bow to the master. Turning, he faced his classmates. His gaze swept the room. They stared back at him in sullen silence, their lips compressed, eyes shifting away from his triumphant gaze. They knew. They understood. Raistlin thrust his hand into his pouch, drew forth some fragrant leaves. "The first plant I'm going to talk about today is marjoram. Marjoram is a spice, named for one of the old gods, Magier." The first few days of the summer of Raistlin's 13th year were unusually hot. The leaves of the Valen woods hung limp and lifeless in the breathless air. The sun, bronzed Caramon's skin, burned Raistlin's as the two made the daily trek back and forth from school to home in the farmer's cart. In school, the pupils were dull and stupid from the heat, spent the days swatting at flies, dozing off, walking to the sting of Master Theobald's willow branch. Finally, even Master Theobald conceded that they were accomplishing nothing. Besides, there was the wizard's conclave he wanted to attend. He gave his students a holiday for 8 weeks. School would recommence in autumn after the harvest. Raistlin was thankful for the holiday. At least it was a break in the dull routine. Yet he hadn't been home for more than a day before he wished he was back in school. Reminded of the teasing, the cabbage, and Master Theobald, he wondered why he wasn't happy at home. And then he realized he wouldn't be happy anywhere. He felt restless, dissatisfied. "You need a girl," Caramon advised. "I hardly think so," Raisin answered acerbically. He glanced over to a group of 3 sisters, pretending to be wholly absorbed in hanging the laundry over the Valenwood limbs to dry, but their attention was not on shirts and petticoats. Their eyes darted daring, smiling glances at Caramon. "Do you realize how silly you look, my brother? You and the others, puffing up your chests and flexing your muscles, throwing axes at trees or flailing away at each other with your fists. All for what? To gain the attention of some giggling girl?" "I get more than giggles, Raist," Caramon said with a lewd wink. "Come on over, I'll introduce you. Lucy said she thought you were cute." "I have ears, Caramon," Raisin returned coldly. "What she said was that your baby brother was cute." Caramon flushed, uncomfortable. "She didn't mean it, Raist. She didn't know. I explained to her that we were the same age and—" Raisin turned and walked away. The girl's heedless words had hurt him deeply, and his pain angered him, for he wanted to be above caring what anyone thought of him. It was this traitorous body of his, first sickly and frail, now teasing him with vague longings and half-understood desires. He considered it all disgusting anyway. Caramon was behaving like a stag during rotting season. Girls, or the lack of them, were not his problem, at least not all of it. He wondered uneasily what was. The heat broke suddenly that night in a violent thunderstorm. Raisin lay awake to watch the bolts of light streak the roiling clouds with eerie pinks and oranges. He revelled in the booms of thunder that shook the Valenwoods and vibrated through the floorboards. A blinding flash, a deafening explosion, the smell of sulphur, and the sound of shattering wood told of a lightning strike nearby. Shouts of "Fire!" were partially lost in the crashing thunder. Caramon and Gylon braved the torrential rain to go out to help battle the blaze. Fire was their worst enemy, though the Valenwood trees were more resistant to fire than most others. A blaze out of control could destroy their entire tree town. Raisin stayed with his mother, who wept and trembled and wondered why her husband hadn't remained home to comfort her. Raisin watched the progress of the flames, his spellbooks clasped fast in his hand in case he and his mother had to run for it. The storm ended at dawn. Only 1 tree had been hit, 3 houses burned. No one had been injured. The families had escaped in time. The ground was littered with leaves and blasted limbs. The air was tainted with a sickening smell of smoke and wet wood. All around Solace, small streams and creeks were out of their banks. Fields that had been parched were now flooded. Raisin left his home to view the damage, along with almost every other person in Solace. He then walked to the edge of the tree line to see the rising water. He stared at the churning waters of the creek. Normally placid, it was now foam-flecked, swirling angrily, gnawing away the banks that had long held it confined. Raisin felt complete sympathy. Autumn came, bringing cool, crisp days and fat, swollen moons, brilliant colors, reds and golds. The rustle and swirl of the falling leaves did not cheer Raisin's mood. The change of the season, the bittersweet melancholy that belongs to autumn, which brings both the harvest and the withering frost, served only to exacerbate his ill humor. This day he would return to school, resume boarding with Master Theobald. Raisin looked forward to going back to school as he had looked forward to leaving it. It was a change, at least. And at least his brain would have something to do besides torment him with images of golden curls, sweet smiles, swelling breasts, and fluttering eyelashes. The late autumn morning was chill. Frost glistened on the red and golden leaves of the Valenwood and rimmed the wooden walkways, making them slippery and treacherous before the sun came out to dry them. Clouds hung grey and lowering over the sentinel peaks. The smell of snow was in the air. There would be snow on the mountain top by the end of the week. Raisin thrust his clothes into a bag. 2 homespun shirts, underclothes, an extra pair of slops, woolen stockings. Most of his clothes were new, made by his mother. He needed the new clothes. He had gained in height that summer, keeping up with Caramon, though he lacked the bulk of his sturdy brother. The added height only served to emphasize Raisin's excessive thinness. Rosamond came out of her bedroom. Pausing, she stared at him with her faded blue eyes. "Whatever are you doing, child?" Raisin glanced up wearily from his work. His mother's soft brown hair was brushed and combed and neatly arranged beneath a cap. She was wearing a clean skirt and bodice over a new blouse, a blouse she had sewn herself under the widow Judith's tutelage. Raisin had tensed instinctively at the sound of her voice. Now, seeing her, he relaxed. His mother was having another good day. She had not had a bad day during his stay at home that summer, and Raisin supposed they had the widow Judith to thank for it. He did not know what to make of the widow Judith. He'd been prepared to distrust her, prepared to discover something nefarious about her, some hidden motive for her selflessness. Thus far, his suspicions had proven unfounded. She was what appeared a widow in her 40s, with a pleasant face, smooth hands, with long, graceful fingers, a melodious voice, a way with words, and an engaging laugh that always brought a smile to Rosamond's pale, thin face. The Majeure house was now clean and well organized, something it had never been before the widow Judith's arrival. Rosamond ate meals at regular hours. She slept through the night, went to market, went visiting, always accompanied by the widow Judith. The widow Judith was friendly to Raisin, though she was not as free and easy with him as she was with Caramon. She was more reserved around Raisin, and he realized she always seemed to be watching him. He could not do anything around the house without feeling her eyes on him. "She knows you don't like her, Raist," Caramon said to him accusingly. Raisin shrugged. That was true, though he couldn't quite explain why. He did not like her, and was quite certain she didn't like him. One of the reasons may have been that Rosamond, Guylon, Caramon, and the widow Judith were a family, and Raisin was not part of it. This was not because he hadn't been invited, but because he willfully chose to remain on the outside. During the evenings when Guylon was home, the 4 would sit outdoors, joking and telling stories. Raisin would remain indoors, poring over his school notes. Guylon was a changed man now that his wife had been rescued from her storm-tossed mind, and was apparently resting comfortably in safer waters. The worry line smoothed from his brow. He laughed more often. He and his wife could actually carry on a relatively normal conversation. Summer work was closer to home. Guylan was able to be with his family more often. Everyone was pleased about this except Raistlin, who had grown accustomed to his father being gone, felt constrained when the big man was around. He didn't particularly like the change in his mother either. He rather missed her odd fancies and flights, missed the times she had been his alone. He didn't like the new warmth between her and Guylan. Their closeness made him feel further isolated. Caramon was obviously Guylan's favorite, and Caramon adored his father. Guylan tried to take an interest in the other twin, but the big woodsman was very like the trees he cut slow growing. Slow moving, slow thinking. Guylan could not understand Raislin's love of magic, and though he had approved sending his son to the mage school, Guylan had secretly hoped the child would find it tedious and leave. He continued to nurture the same hope and always looked disappointed on the day when school recommenced and Raisin began packing. But amidst the disappointment, there was now a relief. Raisin this summer had been like a stranger boarding with a family, and an irritable, unfriendly stranger. Guylan would never admit this, even to himself, but he was going to be glad to see one of his sons depart. The feeling was mutual. Raisin sometimes felt sorry he couldn't love his father more, and he was vaguely aware that Guylan was sorry he couldn't love his strange, unchancy son. No matter, Raisin thought, rolling up his stockings into a ball. Tomorrow I'll be gone. He found it difficult to believe, but he was actually looking forward to the smell of cooked cabbage. "What are you doing with your clothes, Raistlin?" Rosamund asked. "I'm packing, Mother. I return to Master Theobald's tomorrow to board there over the winter." He tried a smile at her. "Had you forgotten?" "No," Rosamund said in tones colder than the frost. "I was hoping that you would not be going back there." Raistlin halted his packing to regard his mother with astonishment. He had expected such words from his father. "What? Not go back to my studies? Why would you think such a thing, Mother?" "It is wicked, Raistlin," Rosamund cried vehemently, with a passion frightening in its intensity. "Wicked, I tell you!" She stamped her foot, drew herself up. "I forbid you to go back there, ever!" "Mother!" Raisin was shocked, alarmed, perplexed. He had no idea what to say. She'd never before protested his chosen field of study. He'd wondered at times if she even knew he was studying magic, much as cared. "Mother, some people think ill of the mages, but I assure you that they are wrong." "Gods of evil," she intoned in a hollow voice. "You worship gods of evil, and at their behest you perform unnatural acts and unholy rites." "The most unnatural thing I've done so far, Mother, is to fall off my stool and nearly split my skull open," said Raisin dryly. Her accusations were so ludicrous, he found it difficult to take the conversation seriously. "Mother, I spent my days droning away after my master, learning to say ah and ooh and ooh. I cover myself with ink and occasionally manage to write something that is almost legible on a bit of parchment or scroll. I tramp about in fields picking flowers. That is what I do, Mother. That is all I do," he said bitterly. "And I assure you that Caramel's job mucking out stables and picking corn is far more interesting and far more exciting than magic." He stopped talking, astonished at himself, astonished at his own feelings. Now he understood. Now he knew what had been chafing at him all summer. He understood the anger and frustration that bubbled like molten steel inside him. Anger and frustration tempered by the fear and self-doubt. Ink and flowers, reciting meaningless words day after day. Where was the magic? When would it come to him? Would it come to him? He shook a sudden chill. Rosamond put her arm around his waist, rested her cheeks against his. "You see, your skin, it's hot to the touch. I think you must have a fever. Don't go back to that dreadful school. You only make yourself sick. Stay here with me. I will teach you all you need to know. We will read books together and work out sums like we used to do when you were little. You will keep me company." Raisin found the idea surprisingly tempting. No more of the inanities of Master Theobald. No more silent, lonely nights in the dormitory. Nights made all the more lonely because he was not alone. No more of this inner torment, this constant questioning. What had happened to the magic? Where had it gone? Why did his blood burn more at the sight of some silly, giggling girl than it did when he copied down his oars in ice? He had lost the magic. Either that or the magic had never been there. He had been fooling himself. It was time to admit defeat. Admit that he had failed. Return home, shut himself away in this cozy, snug room, warm, safe, surrounded by his mother's love. He would take care of her. He would send the widowed Judith packing. Raisin bowed his head, unwilling she should see his bitter unhappiness. Rosamond never noticed, however. She caressed his cheek and playfully turned his face to the looking-glass. The mirror had come with her from Palanthas. It was her prized possession, one of the few relics of her girlhood. "We will have such splendid times together, you and I. Look," she said coaxingly, regarding the two faces in the reflection with complacent pride. "Look how alike we are." Raisin was not superstitious, but her words, spoken in all innocence, were so very ill-omened that he couldn't help but shudder. "You're shivering," Rosamond said, concerned. "There, I said you had a fever. Come and lie down." "No, Mother, I'm fine." "Mother, please." He tried to edge away. Her touch, which had seemed so comforting, was now something loathsome. Raisin was ashamed and appalled that he felt this way about his mother, but he couldn't help him. He could not help himself. She only clasped him more tightly, rested her cheek against his arm. He was taller than she was, by at least a head. "You're so thin," she said. "Far too thin. Food doesn't stick to your bones. You fret it away. And that school, I'm sure, it's making you ill. Sickness is a punishment for those who do not walk the paths of righteousness. So the widow Judith says." Raisin didn't hear his mother. He wasn't listening to her. He was suffocating, felt as if someone were pressing a pillow over his nose and mouth. He longed to break free of his mother's grasp and lush outside, where he could gulp down huge draughts of fresh air. He longed to run and to keep on running, run into the sweet-scented night, journey along a road that would take him anywhere but here. At that moment, Rayson knew a kinship with his half-sister Kitiara. He understood then why she had left, knew how she must have felt. He envied her the freedom of her life, cursed the frail body that kept him chained to home's hearth, kept him fettered in his schoolroom. He'd always assumed the magic would free him, as Kitiara's sword had freed her. But what if the magic did not free him? What if the magic would not come to him? What if he indeed lost the gift? He looked into the mirror, looked into his mother's dream-ravaged face, and closed his eyes against a fear. Snow was falling. The boys were dismissed early, told to go play outdoors until dinner. Exercising in the cold was healthful, expanded the lungs. The boys knew the real reason they were being sent outside. Master Theobald wanted to get rid of them. He had been strangely preoccupied all that day. His mind, what there was of it somewhere else, what there was of it was somewhere else. He taught class absent-mindedly, not seeming to care whether they learned anything or not. He had not had recourse to the willow branch once. Although one of the boys had drifted off to sleep shortly after lunch and slept soundly and noisily through the remainder of the afternoon. Most of the boys considered such inattention on their master's part a welcome change. 3 found it extremely uncomfortable, however, due to the fact that he would occasionally lapse into long, vacant silences, his gaze roving among these 3 eldest in his class. Rayson was among the 3. Outside, the other boys took advantage of the heavy snowfall to build a fort, form armies, and pelt each other with snowballs. Rayson wrapped himself in a warm, thick cloak, a parting gift, oddly enough, from the widow Judith, and left the others to their stupid games. He went for a walk among a stand of pines on the north side of the school. No wind blew. The snow brought a hush to the land, muffling all sound, even the shrill shouting of the boys. He was wrapped in silence. The trees stood unmoving. Animals were tucked away in nest or lair or den, sleeping their winter sleep. All color was obliterated, leaving in its absence the white of the falling snow, the black of the wet tree trunks, the slate gray of the lowering sky. Rayson stood on the edge of the forest. He had intended to walk among the trees, to follow a snow-choked path that led to a little clearing. In the clearing was a fallen log, which served well as a seat. This was Rayson's refuge, his sanctuary. No one knew about it. Pines shielded the clearing from the school and the play yard. Here Rayson came to brood, to think, to sort through his collection of herbs and plants, to mull over his notes, reciting to himself the letters of the alphabet of the language of the arcane. He had been certain, when he'd first marked the clearing as his own, that the other boys would find it and try to spoil it, drag off the log, perhaps, dump their kitchen scraps here, empty their chamber pots in it. The boys had left the clearing alone. They knew he went off somewhere by himself, but they made no attempt to follow him. Rayson had been pleased at first. They respected him at last. The pleasure had soon faded. He came to realize that the other boys left him alone because, after all the nettle incident, they detested him. They had always disliked him, but now they distrusted him so much that they derived no pleasure from teasing him. They left him severely alone. I should welcome this change, he said to himself, but he didn't. He found that he had secretly enjoyed the attention of the others. Even such attention had annoyed, hurt, or angered him. At least by teasing him, they had acknowledged him as one of them. Now he was an outcast. He had meant to walk to the clearing this day, but standing on the outskirts, looking at the trackless snow flowing in smooth frozen ripples around the boles of the trees, he did not enter. The snow was perfect, so perfect that he could not bring himself to walk through it, leaving a floundering trail behind, marring the perfection. The school bell rang. He lowered his head against the icy flakes that a slight rising breeze was blowing into his eyes. Turning, he slogged his way back through the silence and the white and the black and the grey, back to the heat and the torpor and loneliness of the schoolroom. The boys changed their wet clothes and filed down to supper, which they ate under the watchful, if somewhat vacant eye of Marm. Master Theobald entered the room, only if necessary to prevent the floor from being awash in soup. Marm reported any misdeeds to the master, and so the bread tossing and soup spitting had to be kept to a minimum. The boys were tired and hungry after their hard-fought snow battles, and there was less horseplay than usual. The large common room was relatively quiet, except for a few smothered giggles here and there, and thus the boys were extremely surprised when Master Theobald entered. Hastily the boys clambered to their feet, wiping grease from their chins with the backs of their hands. They regarded his arrival with indignation. Dinner was their own personal time, into which the master had no right or reason to intrude.
Okay, I found this on the web for Du Bois Climber.
Theobald either didn't see or decided to ignore the restless feet shuffling, the frowns, the sullen looks. His gaze picked out the three eldest, John Farnish, Gordo, the hapless butcher, and Raisin Magear. Raisin knew immediately why the master had come. He knew what the master was going to say, what was going to happen. He didn't know how he knew. Premonition, some hereditary offshoot of his mother's talent, or simple logical deduction. He did not know, and he didn't care. He couldn't think clearly. He went cold, colder than the snow, fear and exultation vying within him. The bread he had been holding fell from his nervous hand. The room seemed to tilt beneath him. He was forced to lean against the table to remain standing. Master Theobald called off the names of the three, names that Raisin heard only dimly through a roaring in his ears, a roaring as of flames shooting up a chimney. "Walk forward," said the master. Raisin could not move. He was terrified that he would collapse. He was too weak. Was he falling sick? The sight of John Farnish tromping across the floor of the common room with a hang-dog air, certain that he was in trouble, brought a derisive smile to Raisin's lips. His head cleared. The chimney fire had burnt itself out. He strode forward, conscious of his dignity. He stood before Theobald, heard the master's words in his bones, had no conscious recollection of hearing them in his ears. "I have, after long and careful consideration, decided that you three, by virtue of your age and your past performance, will be tested this night to determine your ability to put to use the skills you have learned. Now, don't be alarmed." This to Gordo, whose eyes, white-rimmed and huge with consternation, seemed likely to roll from their sockets. "This test was not the least bit dangerous," the master continued soothingly. "If you fail it, nothing untoward will happen to you. The test will tell me if you have made the wrong choice in wanting to study magic. If so, I will inform your parents and anyone else interested in your welfare." Here he looked very sharply at Raistlin. "That, in my opinion, your remaining here is a waste of time and money." "I never wanted to be here," Gordo blurted out, sweating. "Never. I want to be a butcher." Somebody laughed. Frowning in anger, the master sought the culprit, who immediately hushed and ducked behind one of his fellows. The others were silent. Certain that peace was restored, Theobald looked back at his pupils. "I trust you two do not feel the same way?" John Farnish smiled. "I look forward to this test, master." Raistlin hated John Farnish, could have slain him in that instant. He wanted to have spoken those words, spoken them with that casual tone and careless confidence. Instead, Raistlin could only fumble and stammer. I'm ready." Master Theobald sniffed, as if he very much doubted this statement. "We will see. Come along." He shepherded them out of the common room, the wretched Gordo snivelling and protesting, John Farnish eager and grinning, as if this were playtime, and Raistlin so wobbly in the knees that he could barely walk. He saw his life balanced on this moment, like the dagger Caramon stood on its point on the kitchen table. Raistlin imagined being turned out of the school tomorrow morning, sent home with his small bundle of clothes in disgrace. He pictured the boys lying in the walkway, laughing and hooting, celebrating his downfall. Returning home to Caramon's bluff and bumbling attempts to be sympathetic, his mother's relief, his father's pity. And what would be his future without the magic? Again, Raistlin went cold all over, cold and ice hard, with a terrible knowledge of himself. Without the magic, there could be no future. Master Theobald led them through the library, down a hallway to a spell-locked door leading to the master's private quarters. All the boys knew where the door led, and it was postulated among them that the master's laboratory, of which he often spoke, could be reached through this door. One night, a group of the boys, led by John Farnish, had made a futile attempt to dispel the magic of the lock. John had been forced to explain the next day how he had burned his fingers. The three boys in tow behind him, the master came to a halt in front of the door. He mumbled in a low voice several words of magic, Words which Rayson, despite the turmoil in his soul, made an automatic, concentrated effort to overhear. He was not successful. The words made no sense. He could not think or concentrate, and they left his brain almost the moment they entered. He had nothing in his brain, nothing at all. He could not call to mind how to spell his own name, much less the complicated language of magic. The door swung open. Master Theobald caught hold of Gordo, who was taking advantage of the spell being cast to do a disappearing act of his own. Master Theobald dug his pudgy fingers into Gordo's shoulder, thrust him blubbering and whimpering into a sitting room. John Farnish and Rayson followed after. The door swung shut behind them. "I don't want to do it. Please don't make me. A demon will grab me for sure," Gordo howled. "A demon? What nonsense! Stop this sniveling at once, you stupid boy!" Master Theobald's hand, from force of habit, reached for the willow branch, but he'd left that in the schoolroom. His voice hardened. "I shall slap you if you don't control yourself this instant." The master's hand, though empty, was broad and large. Gordo glanced at it and fell silent, except for a snivel now and then. "Won't do no good me going down there," he said sullenly. "I'm rotten this here magic." "Yes, you are," the master agreed. "But your parents have paid for this, and they have a right to expect you to at least make the attempt." He moved a fancifully braided rug aside with his foot, revealing a trapdoor. This, too, was wizard-locked. Again the master mumbled arcane words. He passed his hand 3 times over the lock, reached down, clasped hold of an iron ring, and lifted. The trapdoor opened silently. A set of stone stairs led down into warm, scented darkness. "Gordo and I will go first," Master Theobald said, adding caustically, "to clear the place of demons." Grasping the unfortunate Gordo by the scruff of his neck, Theobald dragged him down the stairs. John Farnish clattered eagerly after him. Rayson started to follow. His foot was on the top stair when he froze. He was about to set foot into an open grave. He blinked his eyes, and the image vanished. Before him were nothing more sinister than cellar stairs. Still, Rayson wavered there on the threshold. He had learned from his mother to be sensitive to dreams and portents. He'd seen the grave quite clearly, and he wondered what it meant, or if it meant anything at all. Probably it was nothing more than his cursed fancy, his overactive imagination, yet still he hovered on the stairs. John Farnish was down there, except it wasn't John Farnish. It was Caramon, standing over Rayson's grave, gazing down at his twin in pitying sorrow. Rayson shut his eyes. He was far from this place, in his clearing, seated on the log, the snow falling on him, filling his world, leaving it cold, pure, trackless. When he opened his eyes, Caramon was gone, and so was the grave. His step quick and firm, Rayson walked down the stairs. The laboratory was not as Rayson or any of the other boys in their class had imagined. Much speculation had been given to this hidden chamber during clandestine midnight sessions in the dormitory room. The master's laboratory was generally conceded to be pitch dark, knee-deep in cobwebs and bats' eyeballs, with a captured demon imprisoned in a cage in a corner. The elder boys would whisper to the new boys at the start of the year that the strange sounds they could hear at night were made by the demon rattling his chains, trying to break free. From then on, whenever there was a creak or bump, the new boys would lie in bed and tremble in fear, believing that the demon had freed itself at last. The night, the cat, mousing among the pots and kettles, knocked an iron skillet off the wall, caused a general outbreak of panic, with the result of that the master had been wakened by the heart-rending cries of terror, heard the story, and banned all conversation after the candles had been removed. Gordo had been one of the most inventive when it came to giving life to the demon in the laboratory, effectively frightening the wits out of 3 6-year-olds currently boarding in the school. But it was now apparent that Gordo had scared no one quite as much as himself. When he turned around and actually beheld a cage in the corner, its bars shining in the soft white light cast by a globe suspended from the ceiling, the boy's knees gave way and he sank to the floor. "Drat the boy, whatever is the matter with you? Stand on your 2 feet. Master Theobald gave Gordo a prod and a shake. "Good evening, my beauties," the master added, peering into the cage. "Here's dinner." The wretched Gordo turned quite pale, evidently seeing himself as the next course. The master was not referring to the boys, however, but to a hunk of bread that he dredged up from his pocket. He deposited the bread in the cage, where it was immediately set upon by 4 lively field mice. Gordo put his hand on his stomach and said he didn't feel quite so good. Under other circumstances, Raistlin might have been amused by the discomfiture of one of his most inveterate tormentors. Tonight he was far too pent-up, anxious, eager and nervous to enjoy the whimperings of the chastened bully. The master made Gordo sit down on the floor with his head between his legs, and then went to a distant part of the laboratory to putter about among papers and inkpots. Bored, John Farnish began teasing the mice. Raistlin moved out of the glare of the light, moved back into the shadows where he could see without being seen. He made a methodical sweep of the laboratory, committing every detail to his excellent memory. Long years after he left Master Theobald's school, Raistlin could still shut his eyes and see every item in that laboratory, and he was only in it once. The lab was neat, orderly, and clean. No dust, no cobwebs. Even the mice were sleek and well-groomed. A few magical spellbooks, bound in non-committal colors of gray and tan, stood upon a shelf. 6 scroll cases reposed in a bin designed to hold many more. There was an assortment of jars intended for storing spell components, but only a few had anything in them. The stone table, on which the master was supposed to perform experiments in the arcane, was as clean as the table on which he ate his dinner. Raistlin felt a sadness seep into him. Here was the workshop of a man with no ambition, of a man in whom the creative spark had flickered out, presuming that spark had ever once been kindled. Theobald came to his lab not to create, but because he wanted to be alone, to read a book, throw crumbs to the mice in their cage, crush some oregano leaves for the luncheon stew, perhaps drawing up a scroll now and then, a scroll whose magic might or might not work. Whether it did or it didn't was all the same to him. "Feeling better, Gordo?" Master Theobald bustled about importantly, doing very little with a great deal of fuss. "Fine. I knew I would. I knew you would." Sorry, that's Master Theobald saying that. "Fine. I knew you would. Too much excitement, that's all. Take your place at the end of the table. John Farnish, you take your place there in the center. Raistlin, where the devil? Oh, there you are." Master Theobald glared at him crossly. "What are you doing, skulking about there in the darkness? Come stand in the light like a civilized human being. You will take your place at the far end. Yes, right there." Raistlin moved to his assigned seat in silence. Gordo stood hunched-shouldered and glum. The laboratory was a sad disappointment, and this was starting to look far too much like schoolwork. Gordo was bitter over the lack of a demon. John Farnish took his seat, smiling and confident, his hands folded calmly on the table in front of him. Raistlin had never hated anyone in his life as much as he hated John Farnish at that moment. Every organ in Raistlin's body was tangled up with every other organ. His bowels squirmed and wrapped around his stomach. His heart lurched and pressed painfully against his lungs. His mouth was dry, so dry. His throat closed and set him coughing. His palms were wet. He wiped his hands surreptitiously on his shirt. Master Theobald sat at the head of the table. He was grave and solemn and appeared to take exception to the grinning John Farnish. He frowned and tapped his finger on the table. John Farnish, realizing his mistake, swallowed his grin and was immediately as grave and solemn as a cemetery owl. "That's better," said the master. "This test you are about to take is quite a serious matter, as serious as a test you will take when you are grown and prepared to advance through the various ranks of magical knowledge and power. I repeat, this test is every bit as serious, for if you do not pass the one, you will never have a chance to take the other." Gordo gave a great gaping yawn. Master Theobald cast him a reproving glance, then continued, "It would be advisable if we could give this test to every child who enrolls in one of the mage schools prior to his or her entrance. Unfortunately, that is not possible. In order to take this test, you must possess a considerable amount of arcane knowledge. Thus, the Conclave has deemed that the student should have at least 6 years of study before taking the elementary test. Those who have completed 6 years will be given the elementary test, even if they have previously shown neither talent or inclination." Theobald knew, but did not say, that the failed student would then be placed under surveillance, watched throughout the rest of his life. It was improbable, but such a failure might become a renegade wizard, one who refused to follow the laws of magic as handed down and adjudicated by the Conclave. Renegade wizards were considered extremely dangerous, rightly so, and were hunted by the members of the Conclave. The boys knew nothing about renegade wizards, and Master Theobald wisely refrained from mentioning it. Gordo would have been a nervous wreck the remainder of his existence. The test is simple for one who possesses the talent, extremely difficult for one who does not. Every person wanting to advance in the study of magic takes the same elementary test. You are not casting a spell, not even a cantrip. It will take many more years of study and hard work before you have the discipline and control necessary to cast the most rudimentary of magical spells. This test merely determines whether or not you have what was called in the old days the God's gift. He was referring to the old gods of magic, 3 cousins, Solinary, Lunitary, Nuitary. Their names were all that was left of them, according to most people on Ansalon. Their names clung to their moons, to the silver moon, the red, and the supposed black moon. Wary of public opinion, aware that they were not universally liked or trusted, the wizards took care not to become involved in religious arguments. They taught their pupils that the moons influenced magic much the way they influenced the tides. It was a physical phenomenon, nothing spiritual or mystical about it. Yet Raistlin wondered, had the gods truly gone from the world, leaving only their lights burning in the night's window? Or were those lights glints from immortal, ever-watchful eyes? Master Theobald turned to the wooden shelves behind him, opened a drawer. He drew out 3 strips of lamb's skin, placed a strip in front of each boy. John Famish was taking this quite seriously now, after the master's speech. Gordo was resigned, sullen, wanting to end this and return to his mates. He was probably already concocting the lies he would tell about the master's laboratory. Raistlin examined the small strip of lamb's skin, no longer than his forearm. The skin was soft. It had never been used, was smooth to the touch. The master placed a quill pen and an ink pot in front of each of the 3 boys. Standing back, he folded his hands over his stomach and said in solemn, sonorous tones, "You will write down on this lambskin the words I, Magus." The rest of his life. It was improbable, but such a failure might become a renegade wizard. Oh, sorry again, there's a typo here. So standing back, he folded his hands over his stomach and said in solemn, sonorous tones, "You will write down on this lambskin the words, I, Magus." "Nothing else, master?" asked John Farnish. "Nothing else." Gordo squirmed and bit the end of his quill. "How do you spell Magus?" Master Theobald fixed him with a reproving stare. "That is part of the test." What will happen if we do it right, master?" Raistlin asked in a voice that he could not recognize as his own. "If you have the gift, something will happen. If not, nothing," replied Master Theobald. He did not look at Raistlin as he spoke. He wants me to fail, Raistlin understood, without quite knowing why. The master did not like him, but that wasn't the reason. Raisin guessed that it had something to do with jealousy of his sponsor, Antimodus. The knowledge strengthened his resolve. He picked up the quill, which was black, had come from the wing of a crow. Various types of quills were used to write various scrolls. An eagle's feather was extremely powerful, as was that of the swan. A goose quill was for everyday ordinary writing, only to be used for magical penning in emergency. A crow quill was useful for almost any type of magic, though some of the more fanatic white robes objected to its color. Raisin touched the feather of his finger with his finger. He was extraordinarily conscious of the feather's feel, its crispness, contrasting oddly with its softness. Rainbows cast by the globe light shimmered on the feather's glistening black surface. The point was newly cut, sharp. No cracked and sputtering pen for this important event. The smell of the ink reminding him of Antimodus and the time he had praised Raisin's work. Raisin had long ago discovered through eavesdropping on a conversation between the master and Guylen that Antimodus was paying the bill for the school, not the conclave, as the Archmagus had intimated. This test would prove if his investment had been sound. Raisin prepared to dip the quill in the ink, then hesitated, feeling a qualm of near panic. Everything he had been taught seemed to slide from his mind, like butter melting in a hot skillet. He could not remember how to write, how to spell magus. The quill shook in his sweaty fingers. He glanced sidelong through lower lashes at the other two. "I'm done," said Gordo. Ink covered his fingers. He'd managed to splash it on his face, where the black splotches overlapped the brown freckles. He held up the scroll on which he'd first printed the word Magos. Having sneaked a peek at John Farnish's scroll, Gordo had hastily crossed out Magos and written Magus in next to it. "I'm done," Gordo repeated loudly. "What happens now?" "For you, nothing," said Theobald with a severe look. "But I wrote the words just as good as him," Gordo protested, sulking. "Have you learned nothing, you stupid boy?" Theobald demanded angrily. "A word of magic must be written perfectly, spelled correctly the first time. You are writing not only with a lamb's blood, but with your own blood. The magic flows through you and into the pen, and from there onto the scroll." "Oh, bugger it," said Gordo, and he shoved the scroll off the table. John Farnish was writing with ease, seemingly, the pen gliding over the sheepskin, a spot of ink on his right forefinger. His handwriting was readable, but tended to be cramped and small. Raisin dipped the quill in the ink and began to write, in sharply angled, bold, large letters, the words, "I, Magus." John Farnish sat back, a look of satisfaction on his face. Raisin, just finishing, heard the boy catch his breath. Raisin looked up. The letters on the sheepskin in front of John Farnish had begun to glow. The glow was faint, a dim red-orange, a spark newly struck, struggling for life. Guard, said Gordo, impressed. This almost made up for the demon. Well done, John, said Master Theobald expansively. Flushed with pleasure, John Farnish gazed in awe at the parchment, and then he laughed. I have it, he cried. Master Theobald turned his gaze to Raistlin. Though the master attempted to appear concerned, one corner of his lip curled. The black letters on the sheepskin in front of Raistlin remained black. Raistlin clutched a quill so violently he snapped off the top. He looked away from the exultant John Farnish. He paid no attention to the scornful Gordo. He blotted out from his mind the leering triumph of the master. He concentrated on the letters in I Magus, and he said a prayer. Gods of magic, if you are gods and not just moons, don't let me fail, don't let me falter. Raistlin turned inward to the very core of his being, and he vowed, I will do this. Nothing in my life matters except this. No moment in my life exists except this moment. I am born in this moment, and if I fail, I will die in this moment. Gods of magic, help me. I will dedicate my life to you. I will serve you always. I will bring glory to your name. Help me, please, help me. He wanted this so much. He had worked so hard for it for so long. He focused on the magic, concentrated all his energy. His frail body began to wilt beneath the strain. He felt faint and giddy. The globe of light expanded in his dazed vision to 3 globes. The floor was unsteady beneath him. He lowered his head in despair to the stone table. The stone was cool and firm beneath his fevered cheek. He shut his eyes. Hot tears burned the lids. He could still see imprinted on his eyelids the 3 globes of magical light. To his astonishment, he saw that inside each globe was a person. One was a fine, handsome young man, dressed all in white robes that shimmered with a silver light. He was strong and well-muscled, with the physique of a warrior. He carried in his hand a staff of wood, topped by a golden dragon's claw holding a diamond. Another was also a young man, but he was not handsome. He was grotesque. His face was as round as a moon. His eyes were dry, dark, and empty wells. He was dressed in black robes, and he held in his hands a crystal orb, inside which swirled the heads of 5 dragons, red, green, blue, white, and black. Standing between the 2 was a beautiful young woman. Her hair was as black as a crow's wing, streaked with white. Her robes were as red as blood. She held in her arms a large leather-bound book. The 3 were vastly different, strangely alike. Do you know who we are? Asked the man in white. Raistlin nodded hesitantly. He knew them. He wasn't quite sure he understood why or how. You pray to us, yet many speak our names with their lips only, not their hearts. Do you truly believe in us? Asked the woman in red. Raistlin considered this question. You came to me, didn't you? He answered. The glib answer displeased the god of light and the god of darkness. The man with the moon face grew colder, and the man in white looked grim. The woman in red was pleased with him, however. She smiled. Solinary spoke sternly. You are very young. Do you understand the promise you have made to us? The promise to worship us and glorify our names? To do so will go against the beliefs of many, may put you into mortal danger." "I understand," Rayson answered without hesitation. Nuitari spoke next, his voice like splinters of ice. "Are you prepared to make the sacrifices we will require of you?" "I'm prepared," Rayson answered steadily, adding, but only to himself after all, "What more can you demand of me that I have not already given?" The three heard his unspoken response. Solinary shook his head. Nuitari wore a most sinister grin. Lunitary's laughter danced through Rayson, exhilarating, disturbing. "You do not understand, and if you could foresee what will be asked of you in the future, you would run from this place and never come back. Still, we have watched you, and we have been impressed with you. We grant your request on one condition. Remember always that you have seen us and spoken to us. Never deny your faith in us, or we will deny you." The three globes of light coalesced into one, looking very much like an eye, with a white rim, a red iris, a black pupil. The eye blinked once and then remained wide open, staring. The words "I Magus" were all he could see, black on white lamb skin. "Are you ill, Raistlin?" The master's voice, as through a dank fog. "Shut up," Rayson breathed. "Doesn't the fool know they are here? Doesn't he know they are watching, waiting?" "I Magus," Rayson whispered the words aloud. Black on white, he imbued them with his heart's blood. The black letters began to glow, red, like the sword resting in the blacksmith's forge fire. The letters burned hotter and brighter until I Magus was traced in letters of flame. The lamb skin blackened, curled in upon itself, was consumed. The fire died. Rayson, exhausted, sagged on his stool. On the stone table before him was nothing but a charred spot and bits of greasy ash. Inside him burned a fire that would never be quenched, perhaps not even in death. He heard a noise, a sort of strangled croak. Master Theobald, Gordo, and John Farnish were all staring at him, wide-eyed and open-mouthed. Rayson slid off his stool, made a polite bow to the master. "May I be excused now, sir?" Theobald nodded silently, unable to speak. He would later tell the story of the conclave, tell of the remarkable test performed by one of his young pupils, relate how the lamb skin had been devoured by the flames. Theobald added, with due modesty, that it was his skill as a teacher that had undoubtedly inspired his young pupil, wrought such a miracle. Antimodus would make a special point to inform Parsalian, who noted the incident with an asterisk next to Rayson's name in the book, where he kept a list of every student of magic in Ansalon. That night, when the others were asleep, Rayson wrapped himself in his thick cloak and slipped outside. The snow had stopped falling. The stars and the moons were scattered like a rich lady's jewels across the black sky. Solinary was a shining diamond, Lunitary a bright ruby, Nuitary, ebony, and onyx could not be seen, but he was there. He was there. The snow glistened white and pure and untouched in the lambent light of the stars and moons. The trees cast double shadows that streaked the white with black, black tinged with blood red. Rayson looked up at the moons and he laughed, ringing laughter that echoed amongst the trees, laughter that could be heard all the way to heaven. He dashed headlong in the woods, trampling the white, unbroken snowbanks, leaving his tracks, his mark. The magic is in the blood. It flows from the heart. Every time you use it, part of yourself goes with it. Only when you are prepared to give of yourself and receive nothing back will the magic work for you. Theobald Beckham, Master. Rayson sat on his stool in the classroom, hunched over his desk, laboriously copying a spell. It was a sleep spell. Simple for an experienced wizard, but still far beyond the reach of a 16-year-old, no matter how precocious. Rayson knew this because, though he had been forbidden to do so, he had attempted to cast a spell. Armed with his elementary spellbook smuggled out of school beneath his shirt, and the requisite spell component, Rayson had tried to cast a spell on his uneasy but steadfastly loyal brother. He had spoken the words, flung the sand into Caramon's face, and waited. "Stop that, Caramon. Put your hands down." "But Race, I got sand in my eyes." "You're supposed to be asleep." "I'm sorry, Race. I guess I'm not just tired. It's almost supper time." With a deep sigh, Rayson had returned the spellbook to its place at his desk, the sand to its jar in the laboratory. He'd been forced to acknowledge that perhaps Master Theobald knew what he was talking about, on this occasion at least. Casting a magic spell required something more than words and sand. If that was all it took, Gordo would have been a mage and not slaughtering sheep as he was now. "The magic comes from within," Master Theobald had lectured. "It begins at the center of your being, flows outward. The words pick up the magic as it surges from your heart up into your brain, and from thence into your mouth. Speaking the words, you give the magic form and substance, and thus you cast the spell. Words spoken from an empty mouth do nothing but move the lips." And though Rayson more than suspected Master Theobald of having copied this lecture from someone else, in fact, Rayson was to find it several years later in a book written by Parsanian. The young student had been impressed by the words and had noted them down carefully in front of his spellbook. That speech was in his thoughts as he copied for the 100th time the spell onto scrap paper, preparatory to copying the spell into his primer, a leather-bound book. The primer was given to each novice mage who had passed his initial test. The novitiate would copy into his primer every spell committed to memory. In addition, he must also know how to pronounce correctly the words of the spell, and how to write it onto a scroll, and he must know and have collected any components that the spell required. Every quarter, Master Theobald tested the novitiates. There were two in his school, Rayson and John Farnish, on the spells they had learned. If the students performed to the master's satisfaction, they were permitted to write the spell into their primers. Only yesterday, at the end of the spring quarter, Raistlin had taken the test on his new spell, and had passed it easily. John Farnish, by contrast, had failed, having transposed 2 letters into the 3rd word. Master Theobald had given Raistlin permission to copy down the spell, the very sleep spell he'd attempted to cast, into his primer. The master had sent John Farnish to copy the spell out 200 times until he could write it correctly. Raistlin knew the spell, the sleep spell, backward and forward and inside out. He could have written it upside down while standing on his head, yet he could not make it work. He'd even prayed to the gods of magic, asking for their help, as they had given him help during his elementary test. The gods were not forthcoming. He did not doubt the gods, he doubted himself. It was some fault within him, something he was doing wrong, and so, instead of copying the spell into his primer, Raistlin was doing much the same as John Farnish, going over and over the words, meticulously writing down every letter until he could convince himself that he had not made a single mistake. A shadow, a broad shadow, fell across his page. He looked up. "Yes, master," he said, trying to hide his irritation at the interruption and not quite succeeding. Raistlin had long ago realized that he was smarter than Master Theobald and more gifted in magic. He stayed in the school because there was nowhere else to go, and, as this proved, he still had much to learn. Master Theobald could cast a sleep spell. "Do you know what time it is?" Master Theobald asked. "It is dinner time. You should be in the common room with the other boys." "Thank you, but I am not hungry, master," Raistlin said ungraciously and went back to his work. Master Theobald frowned. A well-fed man himself, one who enjoyed his meat and ale, he could not understand someone like Raistlin, to whom food was fuel to keep his body going and nothing more. "Nonsense! You have to eat. What are you doing that is so important it can cause you to skip a meal?" Master Theobald could see perfectly well what Raistlin was doing. "I'm working at copying the spell, master," Raistlin said, gritting his teeth at the man's idiocy. "I do not feel ready yet to write in my primer." Master Theobald looked down at the scraps of paper littering the desk. He picked one up, then another. "But these are adequate, quite good, in fact." "Oh, there must be something wrong," Raistlin said impatiently. "Otherwise I could have been able to cast—" He had not meant to say that. He bit his tongue and fell silent, glowering down at his ink-stained fingers. "Ha!" said Master Theobald with the ghost of a smile, which, since Raistlin was not looking, he did not see. "So, you have been attempting a little spell casting, have you?" Raistlin did not reply. If he could have cast a spell now, he would have summoned demons from the abyss and ordered them to howl off Master Theobald. The master leaned back and laced his fingers over his stomach, which meant that he was about to lounge into one of his lectures. "It didn't work, I take it. I'm not surprised. You are far too proud, young man, far too self-absorbed and self-satisfied. You are a taker, not a giver. Everything flows into you, nothing flows out. The magic is in the blood, it flows from the heart. Every time you use it, part of yourself goes with it. Only when you are prepared to give of yourself and receive nothing back will the magic work for you. Raistlin lifted his head, shook his long, straight brown hair out of his face. He stared straight ahead. "Yes, master," he said coldly, impassively. "Thank you, master." Master Theobald's tongue clicked against the roof of his mouth. "You are seated on a very high horse right now, young man. Someday you will fall off. If the fall doesn't kill you, you might learn something from it." The master grunted. "I'm going to dinner now. I'm hungry." Raistlin returned to his work, a scornful smile curling his lips. That summer, the summer of the twins' 16th year, life for the Magier family continued to improve. Guylen had been hired to help cut a stand of pines on the slopes of Prairie's Eye Peak. The property belonged to an absentee lord who was having the wood hauled north to build a stockade. The job paid well and looked as if it would last a long time, for the stockade was going to be a large one. Caramon worked full-time for the prospering Farmer Sedge, who had extended his land holdings and was now shipping grain, fruit, and vegetables to the markets of Haven. Caramon worked long hours for a portion of the crops, some of which he sold, the rest he brought home. The widow Judith was considered a member of the family. She maintained her small house, but for all practical purposes she lived at the Magiers. Rosamond could not manage without her. Rosamond herself was much improved. She had not fallen into one of her trance-like states in several years. She and the widow performed the chores around the house and spent much of their time visiting the neighbors. Had Guylen known exactly what such visits entailed, he might have been worried about his wife. But he assumed Rosamond and the widow were doing nothing more than sharing the latest gossip. He could not know, nor would he have believed the truth of the matter. Guylen and Caramon both liked the widow Judith. Raistlin grew to dislike her more than ever, perhaps because during the summer he was home with her, whereas the other two were not. He saw the influence the widow wielded over his mother, and he disliked and distrusted it. More than once he came in on their whispered conversations that would end abruptly upon his arrival. He tried to eavesdrop, hoping to hear what the two were saying. The widow Judith had excellent hearing, however, and he was usually discovered. One day, however, the two women happened to be sitting at the kitchen table beneath a window where several pies were cooling. Walking up on them from outside, his footsteps lost amongst the rustling of the leaves of the Valenwood tree, Raistlin heard their voices. He halted in the shadows. "The high priest is not pleased with you, Rosamond Magier. I have a letter from him this day. He wonders why you have not brought your husband and children into the arms of Berzor." Rosamond's response was meek and defensive. She had tried, she had spoken to Guylen of Berzor several times, but her husband had only laughed at her. He did not need to have faith in any god. He'd faith in himself and his good right arm, and that was that. Caramon said he was quite willing to attend the meetings of the Berzorites, especially if they served food. As for Raistlin, Rosamond's voice trailed off. As for Raistlin, he was eager to hear more. But at that moment the widow Judith rose to see to the pies and saw him standing at the corner of the house. He and Judith looked intently at each other. Neither gave anything away to the other, however, except a shared enmity. The widow Judith brought in the pies and closed the shutters. Racine continued on to his garden. Who in the abyss is this Belzor, he wondered, and why does he want to embrace us? It's some sort of thing of mother's, said Caramon upon questioning. You know, one of those women things. They all meet together and talk about stuff. What kind of stuff, I don't know. I went once, but I fell asleep. Rosamond never said anything to Racine about Belzor, rather to Racine's disappointment. He considered bringing up the matter himself, but he feared this would involve talking to the widow Judith, and he avoided contact with her as much as possible. The master was off on his visit to the conclave. School was out for the summer. Racine spent his days planting, cultivating, and adding to his collection of herbs. He was gaining some small reputation among the neighbors for his knowledge of herbs, sold what he himself did not need, and thus was able to contribute to the family's income. He forgot about Belzor. The Major family was happy and prosperous that summer, a summer that would stand out in the twins' mind as golden, a gold that shone all the more brightly in contrast to the coming darkness. Racine and Caramon were walking along the road leading to Soleis, returning from Farmer Sedge. Caramon was coming back from work. Racine had gone to the farmer's to deliver a bundle of dried lavender. His clothes still smelled of the fragrant flower. From that time, he would never be able to abide the scent of lavender. As they neared Soleis, a small boy sighted them, began waving his arms, and broke into a run. He came pounding along the dusty track to meet them. "Hello, young Ned," said Caramon, who knew every child in town. "I can't play goblin ball with you right now, but maybe after dinner we—" "Shh, Caramon," Racine ordered tersely. The child was wide-eyed and solemn as an owlet. "Can't you see something's wrong? What is it? What has happened?" "There's been an accident," the boy managed to gasp, out of breath. Your father—" He might have said more, but he'd lost his audience. The twins were racing for home. Racine ran as fast as he could for a short distance, but not even fear and adrenaline could keep his frail body going for long. His strength gave out and he was forced to slow down. Caramon kept going, but after a few moments, realizing he was alone, he paused to look behind for his brother. Racine waved his brother on ahead. "Are you sure?" Caramon's worried look asked. "I'm sure," Racine's look answered. Caramon nodded once, turned, and kept running. Racine made what haste he could, anxiety knotting his stomach and chilling him, causing him to shiver in the summer sunshine. Racine was surprised at his reaction. He'd not supposed he cared this much for his father. They had driven Guidon in a wagon from Prayer's Eye Peak back to Soleis. Racine arrived to find his father still in the wagon with a crowd gathered around. At the news of the accident, almost everyone in town who could leave his work had come running. come to stare at the unfortunate man in mingled horror, concern, and curiosity. Rosamond stood at the side of the wagon, holding fast to her husband's blood-stained hand and weeping. The widow Judith was at her side. "Have faith in Balzor," the widow was saying, "and he will be healed. Have faith." "I do," Rosamond was saying over and over again through her pale lips. "I do have faith, oh my poor husband. You will be well, I have faith." People standing nearby glanced at each other and shook their heads. Someone went to fetch the stable owner, who was supposed to know all about setting broken bones. Otik arrived from the inn, his chubby face drawn and grieved. He had brought along a jug of his finest brandy, his customary offering in any medical emergency. "Tie Gylon to a stretcher," the widow Judith said. "We'll carry him up the stairs. He will mend better in his own home." A dwarf, a fellow townsman whom Rayson knew by sight, glowered at her. "Are you daft, woman? Jouncing him around like that will kill him." "He shall not die," said the widow Judith loudly. "Balzor will save him." The townspeople standing around exchanged glances. Some rolled their eyes, but others looked interested and attentive. "You better do it fast, then," muttered the dwarf, standing on tiptoe to peer into the wagon. Beside him, a cantor was jumping up and down, clamoring, "Let me see, Flint, let me see." Caramon had climbed into the wagon. Almost as pale as his father, Caramon crouched beside Galen, anxious and helpless. At the sight of the terrible injuries, Galen's cracked rib bones protruded through his flesh, and one leg was little more than a sudden mass of blood and bone. Animal-like, a moan escaped Caramon's lips. Rosamond paid no attention to her stricken son. She stood at the side of the wagon, clutching Galen's hand and whispering frantically about having faith. "Rest," Caramon cried in a hollow voice, looking around in panic. "I'm here, my brother," Rayson said quietly. He climbed into the wagon beside Caramon. Caramon grasped hold of his twin's hand thankfully, gave a shuddering sigh. "Rest, what can you do? We gotta do something. Think of something to do, Rest." "There is nothing to do, son," said the dwarf kindly. "Nothing except wish your father well on his next journey." Raistlin examined the injured man and knew immediately that the dwarf was right. How Galen had managed to live this long was a mystery. "Balzor is here," the widow Judith intoned shrilly. "Balzor will heal this man." Balzor, Raistlin thought bitterly, is taking his own sweet time. "Father!" Caramon cried out. At the sound of his son's voice, Galen shifted his eye. He could not move his head and searched for his sons. His gaze found them, rested on them. "Take care. Your mother," he managed to whisper. A froth of blood coated his lips. Caramon sobbed and covered his face with his hand. "We will, father," Rayson promised. Galen's gaze encompassed both his sons. He managed a fleeting smile, then looked over at Rosamond. He started to say something, but a tremor of pain shook him. He closed his eyes in agony, gave a great groan, and lay still. The dwarf removed his hat, held it to his chest. "Riorx, walk with him," he said softly. "The poor man's dead. Oh, how sad," said the Kandar, and a tear trickled down his cheek. It was the first time death had come so close to Raistlin. He felt it as a physical presence passing among them, dark wings spreading over them. He felt small and insignificant, naked and vulnerable. So sudden. An hour ago, Guylan had walked among the trees, thinking of nothing more important than what he might enjoy for dinner that night. So dark. Endless darkness, eternal. It was not the absence of light that was as frightening as the absence of thought, of knowledge, of comprehension. Our lives, the lives of the living, will go on. The sun shines, the moons rise. We will laugh and talk, and he will know nothing, feel nothing. Nothing. So final. It will come to us all. It will come to me. Rayson thought he should be grieved or sorrowful for his father, but all he felt was sorrow for himself, grief for his own mortality. He turned away from the broken corpse, only to find his mother still clinging to the lifeless hand, stroking the cooling flesh, urging Guylan to speak to her. Caramon, we have to see to Mother, Rayson said urgently. We must take her home. But on turning, he found that Caramon was in need of assistance himself. He had collapsed near the body of his father. Painful, choking sobs wrenched him. Rayson rested his hand comfortingly on Caramon's arm. Caramon's big hand closed convulsingly around his twins. Rayson could not free himself, nor did he want to. He found comfort in his brother's touch, but he didn't like the fey look on his mother's face. Come, Mother. Let the widow Judith take you home. No, no, cried Rosamond frantically. I must not leave your father. He needs me. Mother, Rayson said, now starting to be frightened. Father is dead. There is nothing more. Dead? Rosamond looked bewildered. Dead? No, he can't be. I have faith. Rosamond flung herself on her husband. Her hands grasped his blood-soaked shirt. Guylan, wake up! Guylan's head lolled. A trickle of blood flowed from his mouth. I have faith, Rosamond repeated with a heartbroken whimper. Her hands were bloody. She clung to the blood-soaked shirt. Mother, please go home, Rayson pleaded helplessly. Otik took hold of Rosamond's hands and gently freed her grip. Another neighbor hurriedly covered the body with a blanket. So much for Belzor, said the dwarf in a grating undertone. He had not meant his words to be overheard, but his voice was deep and had a good carrying quality to it. Everyone standing around heard him. A few looked shocked. Several shook their heads. One or two smiled grimly when they thought no one was watching. The widow Judith had done a good deal of proselytizing since her arrival in town, and she'd gained more than a few converts to her new faith. Some of those converts were regarding the dead man with dismay. Who's Belzor? The Kandar asked eagerly in shrill tones. Flint, do you know Belzor? What was he supposed to do? Heal this poor man? Why didn't he? Do you suppose? Hush your mouth, Tass, you doorknob, the dwarf said in a harsh whisper. But this was a question many of the faithful newcomers were asking themselves. They looked to the widow Judith for an answer. The widow Judith had not lost her faith. Her face hardened. She glared at the dwarf, glared even more fiercely at the Kandar, who was now lifting the corner of the blanket for a curious peep at the corpse. Perhaps he's been healed and we just haven't noticed. The Kender offered helpfully. He has not been healed, the widow Judith cried out in dolorous tones. Galen Magir has not been healed, nor will he be healed. Why not, do you ask? Because of the sinfulness of this woman. The widow Judith pointed at Rosamond. Her daughter is a whore. Her son is a witch. It is her fault, and the fault of her children, that Galen Magir died. The pointing finger might have been a spear ripping through Rosamond's body. She stared at Judith in shock, then screamed and sank to her knees, moaning. Raistlin was on his feet, climbing over the body of his father. How dare you? He said menacingly to the widow. Reaching the side of the wagon, he vaulted out. Get out of here! He came face to face with the widow. Leave us alone. You see? The widow Judith backed up precipitously. Pointing finger shifted to Raistlin. He is evil. He does the bidding of evil gods. A fire blazed up within Raistlin, blazed up white hot, consumed sense, consumed reason. He could see nothing in the glare of the blaze. He didn't care if the fire destroyed him, just so long as it destroyed Judith. Roost! A hand grabbed him. A hand, as strong and firm, reached into the midst of the blaze and grasped hold of him. Roost, stop! The hand, his brother's hand, dragged Raistlin out of the fire. The terrible white-hot glare that had blinded him died. The fire died, leaving him cold and shivering with a taste of ashes in his mouth. Caramon's strong arms wrapped around Raistlin's thin shoulders. Don't harm her, Raist, Caramon was saying. His voice came out a croak. His throat was raw from weeping. Don't prove her right. The widow, white-faced and blanching, had backed up against a tree. She glanced about at her neighbors. You saw, good people of Solis, he tried to kill me. He's a fiend in human clothing, I tell you. Send this mother and her demon spawn away. Cast them out of Solis. Show Berzor that you will not tolerate such evil. The crowd was silent, their faces dark and impassive. Moving slowly, they came together to form a circle of protective circle with the Magir family in the center. Rosamond crouched on the ground, her head bowed. Raistlin and Caramon stood close together near their mother. Although Kitiara was not there, she had not been with the family in years. Her spirit had been invoked, and she was also present, if only in the minds of her siblings. Galen lay dead in the wagon, his body covered by a blanket. His blood was starting to seep through the wool. The widow Judith stood outside the circle, and still no one spoke. A man shoved his way through from the back of the crowd. Raistlin had only an indistinct impression of him. The still smoldering fire within clouded his vision. But he would remember him as tall, clean-shaven, with long hair that covered his ears, fell to his shoulders. He was clad in leather, trimmed with fringe, and wore a bow over one shoulder. He walked up to the widow. I think you are the one who had better leave Solis, he said. His voice was quiet. He wasn't threatening her, merely stating a fact. The widow scowled at him and flashed a glance around at the people in the crowd behind him. Are you going to let this half-breed talk to me like this? She demanded. Tanis is right, said Otik, waddling forward to lend his support. He waved a pudgy hand in which he still held a brandy jug. "You just go along back to Haven, my good woman, and take Balzar with you. He's not needed around here. We care for our own." "Take your mother home, lads," said the dwarf. "Don't fret about your pa. We'll see to the burial. You'll want to be there, of course. We'll let you know when it's time." Raistlin nodded, unable to speak. He bent down, grasped hold of his mother. She was limp in his hands, limp and shredded, like a rag doll that had been worried and torn by savage dogs. She gazed about her with a vacuous expression that Raistlin remembered well. His heart shriveled within him. "Mother," he said in a choked voice, "we're going to go home now." Rosamond did not respond. She did not seem to have heard him. She sagged, dead weight, in his arms. Caramon. Raistlin looked to his brother. Caramon nodded, his eyes filled with tears. Between them they carried their mother home. The following morning, Guylen Magir was buried beneath the Valen woods, a seedling planted on his grave, as was customary among the inhabitants of Solace. His sons came to the ceremony. His wife did not. "She's sleeping," said Caramon with a blush for his lie. "We didn't want to wake her." The truth was, they could not wake her. By afternoon, everyone in Solace knew that Rosamond Magir had fallen into one of her trances. She'd fallen deep this time, so deep that she could hear no voice, however loved that called to her. The neighbors came, offering condolences and suggestions to aid in her recovery, some of which the use of spirits of hawthorn, for instance, which she was to inhale. Raistlin tried. Others, such as jabbing her repeatedly with a pin, he did not. At least not at first, not before the terrible fear set in. The neighbors brought food to tempt her appetite, for the word spread among their friends that Rosamond would not eat. Otik himself brought an immense basket of delicacies from the inn of the last home, including a steaming pot of his famous spiced potatoes. Otik being firm in the belief that no living being, and very few of the unliving, could hold out long against that wonderful garlic-scented aroma. Caramon took the food with a wan smile and a quiet thank you. He did not let Otik into the house, but stood blocking the door with his big body. "Is she any better?" Otik asked, craning to see over Caramon's shoulder. Otik was a good man, one of the best in Solace. He would have given away his beloved inn if he had thought that would have helped the sick woman. But he did enjoy gossip, and Guylen's tragic death and his wife's strange illness were the talk of the common room. Caramon finally managed to close the door. He stood listening a moment to Otik's heavy footsteps tramping across the boardwalk, heard him stop to talk to several of the ladies of the town. Caramon heard his mother's name mentioned frequently. Sighing, he took the food into the kitchen and stacked it up with all the rest of the provisions. He ladled spiced potatoes into a bowl, added a tempting slab of ham fresh baked in cider, and poured a glass of elven wine. He intended to take them to his mother, but he paused on the threshold of her bedroom. Caramon loved his mother. A good son was supposed to love his mother, and Caramon had been as good a son as he knew how to be. He was not close to his mother. He felt closer to Kitiara, who had done more to raise both him and Rayson than had Rosamond. Caramon pitied his mother with all his heart. He was extremely sad and worried for her, but he had to steel himself to enter that room as he imagined he would one day have to steel himself to enter battle. The sick room was dark and hot, the air fetid and unpleasant to breathe and to smell. Rosamond lay on her back on the bed, staring up at nothing. Yet she saw something, apparently, for her eyes moved and changed expression. Sometimes the eyes were wide, the pupils dilated, as if what she saw terrified her. At these times her breathing grew rapidly and shallow. At other times she was calm. Sometimes she would even smile, a ghastly smile that was heartbreaking to see. She never spoke, at least that they could understand. She made sounds, but these were guttural, incoherent. She never closed her eyes, and she never slept. Nothing roused her or caused her to look away from whatever visions she saw, visions that held her enthralled. Her bodily functions continued. Rayson cleaned up after her, bathed her. It had been 3 days since Guyland's burial, and Rayson had not left his mother's side. He slept on a pallet on the floor, waking at the least sound she made. He talked to her constantly, telling her funny stories about the pranks the boys played at the school, telling her about his own hopes and dreams, telling her about his garden, his herb garden, and the plants he grew there. He forced her to take liquid by dipping a cloth in water, then holding it to her lips and squeezing it into her mouth. Only a trickle at a time, lest she choke on it. He had tried feeding her too, but she had been unable to swallow the food, and he had been forced to give this up. He handled her gently, with infinite tenderness and unflagging patience. Caramon stood in the doorway, watching the two of them. Rayson sat beside his mother's bed, brushing out her long hair and reciting to her stories of her own girlhood in Palanthas. You think you know my brother, Caramon said, talking silently to a line of faces. You, Master Theobald, and you, John Farnish, and you, Sturm Brideblade, and all the rest of you. You call him sly and sneak. You say he's cold and calculating and unfeeling. You think you know him. I know him. Caramon's eyes filled with tears. I know him. I'm the only one. He waited another moment until he could see again, wiping his eyes and his nose on the sleeve of his shirt, slopping the wine over himself in the process. This done, he drew in a last deep breath of fresh air, and then entered the dark and dismal sick room. I brought some food, Rayst, said Caramon. Rayson glanced at his brother, then turned back to Rosamond. She won't eat it. I meant for you, Rayst. You gotta eat something. You'll get sick if you don't. Caramon added, seeing his brother's head start to move in negation. And if you get sick, what will I do? I'm not a very good nurse, Rayst. Rayson looked up at his brother. You don't give yourself enough credit, my brother. I remember times when I was ill. You would make shadow pictures on the wall for me. Rabbits. His voice died away. Caramon's throat closed, choked by tears. He blinked them away quickly and held out the plate. "Come on, Race, eat just a little. It's Otis potatoes." "His panacea for all the ills of the world," Raisin said, his mouth twisting. "Very well." He replaced the brush on a small nightstand. Taking the plate, he ate some of the potatoes and nibbled a little on the ham. Cameron watched anxiously. His face fell in disappointment when Raisin handed back the plate, still more than half filled with food. "Is that all you want? Are you sure? Can I get you something else? We've got lots." Raisin shook his head. Rosamond made a sound, a pitiful murmur. Raisin moved swiftly to attend her, bending over her, talking to her soothingly, helping her to lie more comfortably. He moistened her lips with water, chafed the thin hands. "Is she any better?" Cameron asked helplessly. He could tell at a glance that she wasn't, but he hoped he might be wrong. Besides, he felt the need to say something to hear his own voice. He didn't like it when the house was so strangely quiet. He didn't like it being cooped up in this dark, unhappy room. He wondered how his brother could stand it. "No," Raisin said. "If anything, she's getting worse." He paused a moment, and when he spoke next, his voice was hushed, awed. "It's as if she's running down a road, Caramon, running away from me. I follow after her. I call to her to stop, but she doesn't hear me. She doesn't pay any attention to me. She's running very fast, Caramon." Raisin stopped talking, turned away. He pretended to busy himself with the blankets. "Take that plate back to the kitchen," he ordered, his voice harsh. "It'll draw mice." I'll take the plate back to the kitchen," Caramon mumbled and hurried off. Once in the kitchen, he flung the plate toward what he assumed was the table. He couldn't see very well for the blur in his eyes. Someone knocked on the door, but he ignored it, and after a while, whoever it was went away. Caramon leaned against the fireplace, gulping in deep breaths, blinking very hard and fast, willing himself not to cry anymore. Regaining his composure, he returned to the sick room. He had news that would, he hoped, bring a small amount of cheer to his twin. He found Raisin seated once more by the bed. Rosamond lay in the same position, her staring eyes sunken in her head. Her wasted hands lay limp on the counterpane. Her wrist bones seemed unnaturally large. Her flesh seemed to be slipping away with her spirit. She appeared to have deteriorated in just a few moments. Caramon was gone. He shifted his gaze hurriedly away from her, kept it focused on his twin. "Otik was here," Caramon said unnecessarily, for his brother had surely deduced this from the arrival of the potatoes. "He said that the widow Judith left Solis this morning." "Did she?" Raisin said, a statement, not a question. He looked around. A flicker of flame lit his red-rimmed eyes. "Where did she go?" "Back to Haven." Caramon managed a grin. "She's gone to report us to Belzor. She left claiming he was going to come here and make us sorry we were ever born." An unfortunate choice of phrase. Raisin winced and looked quickly at their mother. Caramon took 2 swift steps, laid his hand on his brother's shoulder, gripped it hard. "You can't think that, Race," he admonished. "You can't think that this is your fault." "Isn't it?" Raisin returned bitterly. "If it hadn't been for me, Judith would have let Mother alone. That woman came because of me, Caramon. I was the one she was after. Mother asked me to quit my magic once. I wondered why she should say such a thing. It was Judith hounding her. If I had only known the... What would you have known, Raistlin? Caramon interrupted. He crouched down beside his brother's chair, looked up at him earnestly. What would you have done? Quit the school? Given up the magic? Would you have done that? Raistlin sat silent a moment, his hands absently plucking the folds of his worn shirt. No, he said finally. But I would have talked to Mother. I would have explained to her. He glanced at his mother. Reaching out, he took hold of the pitifully thin hand, squeezed it, not very gently, willing to see some response, even a grimace of pain. He could have crushed that hand in his hand, crushed it like an empty eggshell, and Rosamond would have never so much as blinked. Sighing, he looked back at Caramon. It wouldn't have made any difference, would it, my brother? Raistlin asked softly. None in the world, Caramon said. Not at all. Raistlin released his mother's hand. The marks of his fingers were red on her pallid flesh. He took hold of his brother's hand and held it tightly. They sat together in silence for long moments, finding comfort in each other. Then Raistlin looked quizzically at his brother. You are wise, Caramon. Did you know that? Caramon laughed. A great guffaw that broke like thunder in the dark room alarmed him. He clapped his hand over his mouth, flushed red. No, I'm not, Raist, he said in a smothered whisper. You know me, stupid as a gully dwarf. Everyone says so. You got all the brains. But that's all right. You need them. I don't. Not so long as we're together. Raistlin abruptly released his grip. He drew his hand away and averted his face. There's a difference between wisdom and intelligence, my brother. His voice was cold. A person may have one without the other. Why don't you go for a walk? Or go back to work for your farmer? But Raist, it's not necessary for both of us to remain here. I can manage. Caramon rose slowly to his feet. Raist, I don't. Please, Caramon, Raistlin said. If you must know the truth, you fidget and fuss, and that drives me to distraction. You will feel better for the fresh air and exercise, and I will be better for the solitude. Sure, Raist, Caramon said. If that's what you want, I guess I'll go see Sturm. His mother came to call and brought some fresh baked bread. I'll just go and say thank you. You do that, Raistlin said dryly. Caramon never knew what brought on these sudden dark and bitter moods, never knew what he'd said or done that quenched the light in his brother as surely as if he doused him with cold water. He waited a moment to see if his brother might relent, say something more, ask him to stay and keep him company. But Raistlin was dipping a bit of cloth into a pitcher of water. He held the cloth to Rosamond's lips. You must drink a little of this, mother, he said softly. Caramon sighed, turned and left. A day later, Rosamond was dead. The twins buried their mother in the grave next to their father. Only a few people stood with them at the burial. The day was wet and chill, with a touch of early autumn in the air. Rain poured down steadily, soaking to the skin those who gathered around the grave. The rain drummed on the wooden coffin, formed a small pool in the grave. The Valenwood sprig they planted drooped, sad and forlorn, half drowned. Raistlin stood bareheaded in the rain, though Caramon had several times anxiously urged him to cover his head with the hood of his cloak. Raistlin did not hear his brother's pleas. He heard nothing but the fall of the drops on the wooden coffin, a small coffin, almost that of a child. Rosamond had shrunk to skin and bones in those terrible last days. It was as if whatever she was seeing held her fast in its claws, gnawed her flesh, fed off her, devoured her. Raistlin knew he himself was going to fall ill. He recognized the symptoms. The fever already burned in his blood. He was alternatingly sweating and shivering. His muscles ached. He wanted so much to sleep, but every time he tried, he heard his mother's voice calling to him, and he would be instantly awake. Awake to the silence, the dreadful silence. He wanted to cry the burial, but he did not. He forced the tears back down his throat. It wasn't that he was ashamed of them. He did not know for certain for whom he wept, for his dead mother or for himself. He was not aware of the ceremony. He was not aware of the passage of time. He might have been standing on the edge of that grave all his life. He knew it was over only when Caramon plucked at his sleeve. At that, it wasn't Caramon who convinced his twin to leave, but the sound of the dirt clods striking the coffin, a hollow sound that sent a shudder through Raistlin. He took a step, stumbled, and nearly fell into the grave. Caramon caught him, steadied him. "Raist, you're burning up!" Caramon exclaimed in concern. "Did you hear her, Caramon?" Raistlin asked anxiously, peering down at the coffin. "Did you hear her calling for me?" Caramon put his arm around his twin. "We have to get you home," he said firmly. "We must hurry," Raistlin gasped, shoving aside his brother's hand. He seemed intent on leaping into the grave. "She's calling me." But he couldn't walk properly. Something was wrong with the ground. It rolled like the back of a leviathan, rolled and pished him off. He was sinking into the grave. The dirt was falling on him. And still he could hear her voice. Raistlin collapsed, fell to the ground at the graveside, his eyes closed. He lay unmoving in the mud and fallen leaves. Caramon bent over him. "Raist," he called, giving him a little shake. His twin did not respond. Caramon glanced around. He was alone with his brother, except for the grave digger, who was shoveling as rapidly as he could to get out of the wet. The other mourners had left as soon as decently possible, heading for the warmth of their homes or their crackling fire in the inn of the last home. They had spoken their final condolences hurriedly, not really knowing what to say. No one had known Rosamond very well. No one had liked her. There was no one to help Caramon, no one to advise him. He was on his own. He bent down to prepare to lift his brother in his arms and carry him home. A pair of shining black boots and the hem of a brown cloak came into view. "Hello, Caramon." He looked up, thrust back his hood to see better. The rain poured down, streamed from his hair into his eyes. A woman stood in front of him. A woman around 20 years of age, maybe older. She was attractive, though not beautiful. Her hair beneath her hood was black and curled damply around her face. Her eyes were dark and bright, perhaps a little too bright, shining with a diamond's hardness. She wore brown leather armor, molded to fit over her curvaceous figure. A green loose-fitting blouse, green woolen hose, and the shining black boots that came to her knees. A sword hung from her hip. She seemed familiar. Caramon knew he knew her, but he didn't have time to sort through the lumber yard that was his memory. He mumbled something about having to help his brother, but the woman was now down beside him, kneeling over Raistlin. "He's my brother too, you know," she said, and her mouth twisted in a crooked smile. "Kit?" Caramon gasped, recognizing her at last. What are you? Where did you? How did? Here. We better get him somewhere warm and dry," Kitiara interrupted, taking charge of the situation, much to Caramon's relief. She was strong, as strong as a man. Between the two of them, they lifted Raisin to his feet. He roused briefly, stared around with unfocused eyes, muttered something. His eyes rolled back, his head lolled. He lost consciousness again. He's never been this sick," Caramon said, his fear as something real and alive inside him, squeezing his heart. "I've never seen him this bad." "Bah, I've seen worse," said Kitiara confidently. "Lots worse. I've treated worse, too. Arrow wounds in the gut, legs cut off. Don't worry," she added, her smile softening in sympathy for Caramon's anguish. "I fought death before over my baby brother, and I won. I can do it again if need be." They carried Raistlin up the long flight of stairs to the boardwalk, made their way beneath the dipping tree branches to the Medjir's small house. Once inside, Caramon built up the fire. Kit stripped off Raisin's wet clothes with swift, unblushing efficiency. When Caramon ventured a mild, embarrassed protest, Kitiara laughed. "What's the matter, baby brother? Afraid this will shock my delicate feminine sensibilities?" "Don't worry," she added with a grin and a wink. "I've seen men naked before." His face extremely red. Caramon helped his sister lay Raistlin down in his bed. He was shivering so that it seemed he might fall out. He spoke, but he made no sense and would occasionally cry out and stare at them with wide, fever-dilated eyes. Kit rummaged through the house, found every blanket and piled them over him. She placed her hand on his neck to feel his pulse beat, pursed her lips in a thoughtful frown, and shook her head. Caramon stood by, watching anxiously. "Is that crone still around?" Kit asked abruptly. "You know, the one who talked at trees and whistled like a bird and kept a wolf for a pet?" "Weird Megan? Yeah, she's still around, I guess." Caramon was doubtful. "I don't go that part of town much. Father doesn't." He paused, swallowed, and began over. "Father didn't want us to go there." "Father isn't around anymore. You're on your own now, Caramon." Kitiara returned with brutal frankness. "Go to Weird Megan's and tell her you need elixir of willow bark, and hurry up. We've got to bring down this fever." "Elixir of willow bark," Caramon repeated to himself several times. He put on his cloak. "Anything else?" "Not right now. Oh, and Caramon," Kitiara halted him as he stood in the open doorway. "Don't tell anyone I'm back in town, will you?" Sure, Kit," Caramon answered. "Why not?" "I don't want to be bothered by a lot of tittle-tattles, snooping around and asking questions. Now go along." Wait, do you have any money? Caramon shook his head. Kitiara reached into a leather purse she wore on her belt, fished out a couple of steel coins, and tossed them to Caramon. On your way back from the Old Crones, stop by Otik's and buy a jug of brandy. Is there anything in the house to eat? Caramon nodded. The neighbors brought lots of stuff. Ah, I forgot. The funeral meats. All right, go on. Remember what I said. Tell no one I'm here. Caramon departed, a little curious about his sister's injunction. After several moments of long and considered thought, he at last decided that Kitiara knew what she was doing. If word got out that she was in town, every gossip from here to the plains of dust would be snooping around. Raistlin needed rest, and he needed quiet, not a stream of visitors. Yes, Kit knew what she was doing. She would help Raistlin. She would. Caramon generally took a positive view of things. He was not one to fret over what had happened in the past or worry about what might come in the future. He was honest and trusting. And like many honest, trusting people, he believed that everyone else was honest and trustworthy. He put his faith in his sister. He hastened through the pouring rain to Weird Megan's, who lived in a tumble-down shack that sat on the ground beneath the Valenwood trees, not far from the disreputable bar known as the Trough. Concentrating on his errand, muttering willow bark, to himself over and over, Caramon almost tripped over an ancient grey wolf lying across the threshold. The wolf growled. Caramon backed up precipitously. Nice doggy, Caramon said to the wolf. The wolf rose to its feet, the fur on its back bristling, its lips parted in a snarl, showing extremely yellow but very sharp teeth. The rain beat down on Caramon. His cloak was wet through. He stood ankle-deep in mud. He could see candlelight in the window and a figure moving around inside. He made another attempt to pass the wolf. There's a good dog, he said, and started to pat the wolf on the head. A snap of the yellow teeth nearly took off Caramon's hand. Abandoning the door, Caramon thought he might tap on the window pane. The wolf thought he wouldn't. The wolf was right. Caramon couldn't leave, not without the elixir. Shouting at the door wasn't very polite, but in these circumstances it was all the desperate Caramon had left to try. Caramon flushed, started over. Mistress Megan! Mistress Megan! A face appeared in the window, the face of a middle-aged woman with grey hair pulled back tight. Her eyes were bright and clear. She didn't look crazy. She gazed intently at the sopping wet Caramon, then left the window. Caramon's heart sank into the mud, which seemed to be up around his knees now. Then he heard a grating sound, as of a bar being lifted. The door swung open. She spoke a word to the wolf, a word Caramon couldn't understand. The wolf rolled over, all four paws in the air, and the crone scratched its belly. Well, boy, she said, looking up, what do you want? The weather is a bit inclement for you to be throwing rocks at my house, isn't it? Caramon went red as a pickled beet. The rock-throwing incident had happened a long time ago. He'd been a small boy at the time, and he'd assumed she wouldn't recognize him. Well, what do you want? She repeated. Bark, he said in a low voice, ashamed, flustered, and embarrassed. Some sort of bark, I forget what. What's it for? Megan asked sharply. Kit, no, I don't mean that. It's my brother. He has a fever. Willow bark elixir. I'll fetch it. The crone eyed him. "I'd ask you to come in out of the rain, but I'll wager you wouldn't." Caramon peered past her into the shack. A warm fire looked inviting, but then he saw the skull on the table, a human skull, with various other bones lying about. He saw what looked like a rib cage attached to his spine. If it had not been too terrible to even imagine, Caramon might have thought the woman was attempting to build a person, starting from the bones and working outward. He took a step backward. "No, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. But I'm quite comfortable where I am." The crone grinned and chuckled. She shut the door. The wolf curled up on the threshold, keeping one yellow eye on Caramon. He stood miserably in the rain, worried over his brother, hoping the crone wouldn't be long, and wondering uneasily if he dared trust her. Perhaps she might need more bones for her collection. Perhaps she'd gone to get an axe. The door opened with a suddenness that made Caramon jump. Megan held out a small vial made of glass. "Here you go, boy. Tell your sister to have Rayson swallow a large spoonful morning and night until the fever breaks. Understand?" "Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am." Caramon fumbled for the coins in his pocket. Realizing suddenly what she'd said, he stammered. It's not for my sister. She's not here, exactly. She's away. I don't..." Caramon shut his mouth. He was a hopeless liar. Megan chuckled again. "Of course she is. I won't say anything to anyone. Never fear. I hope your brother gets well. When he does, tell him to come visit me. I miss seeing him." "But my brother comes here?" Caramon asked, astonished. "All the time. Who do you think taught him his herb lore? Not that dundering idiot Theobald. He wouldn't know a dandelion from a crabapple if you bit him on the ass. You remember the dose, or do you want me to write it down?" I remember," Caramon said. He held out a coin. Megan waved it away. "I don't charge my friends. I was sorry to hear about your parents. Come visit me yourself sometime, Caramon Major. I would enjoy talking to you. I'll wager you're smarter than you think you are." "Yes, ma'am," said Caramon politely, having no idea what she meant and no intention of ever taking her up on her offer. He made an awkward bow, and holding the vial of willow bark elixir as tenderly as a mother holds her newborn child, he slugged through the mud to the staircase leading back into the trees. His thoughts were extremely confused. Raistlin visiting that old crone? Learning things from her? Maybe he touched that skull. Caramon grimaced. It was all extremely baffling. He was so flustered that he completely forgot what he supposed, that he was supposed to stop at the inn for the brandy. He received a severe scolding from Kit when he reached home, and had to go back out in the rain after it. Raistlin was very ill for several days. The fever would subside somewhat after a dose of the willow bark, but it would always come back up again, and each time it seemed to go higher. Kitiara made light of his twin's illness whenever Caramon asked, but he could tell she was worried. Sometimes in the night, when she thought he was asleep, he'd hear Kit give a sharp sigh, see her drum her fingers on the arm of her mother's rocking chair, which Kit had dragged into the small room the twins shared. Kitiara was not a gentle nurse. She had no patience with weakness. She had determined that Raistlin would live. She was doing everything in her power to force him to get better, and she was irritated and even a little angry when he did not respond. At that point, she decided to take the fight personally. The expression on her face was so grim and hard and determined that Caramon wondered if death might not be a little daunted to face her. Death must have been, because that grim presence back down. On the morning of the 4th day of his twins' illness, Caramon woke after a troubled night. He found Kit slumped over the bed, her head resting on her arms, her eyes closed in slumber. Rayson slept as well. Not the heavy, dream-tortured sleep of his sickness, but a healing sleep, a restful sleep. Caramon reached out his hand to feel his brother's pulse, and in doing so brushed against Kitiara's shoulder. She bolted to her feet, caught hold of the collar of his shirt with one hand, twisted the cloth tight around his neck. In her other hand, a knife flashed in the morning sunlight. "Kit, it's me!" Caramon croaked, half strangled. Kitiara stared at him without recognition. Then her mouth parted in a crooked grin. She let loose of him, smoothed the wrinkles from his shirt. The knife disappeared rapidly, so rapidly that Caramon could not see where it had gone. "You startled me," she said. "No kidding," Caramon replied feelingly. His neck stung from where the fabric had cut into the flesh. He rubbed his neck, gazed wearily at his sister. She was shorter than he was, lighter in build, but he would have been a dead man if he hadn't spoken up when he did. He could still feel her hand tightening the fabric around his throat, cutting off his breathing. An awkward silence fell between them. Caramon had something disquieting in his... Caramon had seen something disquieting in his sister, something chilling. Not the attack itself. What he'd seen that bothered him was a fierce, eager joy in her eyes when she made the attack. "I'm sorry, kid," she said at length. "I didn't mean to scare you." She gave him a playful little slap on his cheek. "But don't ever sneak up on me in my sleep like that, all right?" "Sure, Kit," Caramon said, still uneasy, but willing to admit that the incident had been his fault. "I'm sorry I woke you. I just wanted to see how Rayson was doing." "He's past the crisis," Kitiara said with a weary, triumphant smile. "He's going to be fine." She gazed down on him proudly, as she might have gazed down on a vanquished foe. "The fever broke last night, and it stayed down. We should have him now and let him sleep. We should leave him now and let him sleep." She pushed a reluctant Caramon out the door. "Come along, listen to Big Sister. By way of repaying me for that fright you gave me, you can fix my breakfast." "Fright?" Caramon snorted. "You weren't frightened." "A soldier's always frightened," Kit corrected him. Sitting down at the table, she hungrily devoured an apple, still green, one of this season's first fruits. "It's what you do with a fright that counts." "Huh?" Caramon looked up from his bread slicing. Fear can turn you inside out," Kit said, tearing the apple with strong white teeth. "Or you can make fear work for you. Use it like another weapon. Fear's a funny thing. It can make you weak-kneed, make you pee your pants, make you whimper like a baby, or fear can make you run faster, hit harder." "Yeah, really?" Caramon put a slice of bread on the toasting fork, held it over the kitchen fire. "And yes, I went to the burial. Like it or not, she was my mother. I guess her death was pretty awful for you and raised it." Caramon nodded silently. He didn't like to think about it. Morosely, he munched on the burnt toast. "Do you want some eggs? I can fry them," he said. "Yes, I'm starved. Put in some of Otik's potatoes too, if you've got any left." Kit remained standing by the window. "It's not that Rosamond meant anything to me. She didn't." Her voice hardened. "But it would have been bad luck if I hadn't gone." What do you mean, bad luck? Oh, I know, it's all superstitious nonsense, Kit said with a rueful grin. But she was my mother and she's dead. I should show respect. Otherwise, well, Kit looked uncomfortable. I might be punished. Something bad might happen to me. That sounds like Widow Judith, Caramon said, cracking eggshells, making a clumsy and ineffectual attempt at extricating the egg from the shell. His scrambled eggs were noted for their crunchy texture,